Daenerys Targaryen stood on the prow of the small ship as it glided through the choking mists of the smoking sea. The water shimmered with an oily sheen and the stench of sulfur and ash clung to everything she wore. Behind her, the crew moved quietly. They were men and women willing to brave the lethal waters of Valyria's ruins for a promise of gold and the favor of the Dragon Queen herself. Even if she was still in exile from her homeland, even if her enemies branded her a usurper, to these sailors, Daenerys Stormborn was worth risking everything. She had paid them well with what riches remained after her conquests and struggles in Essos. Her heart pounded with a longing she could not fully explain, a deep-rooted curiosity that surpassed the ordinary thirst for power and rule. Something old was calling her. Something in these haunted ruins beckoned her. She placed a hand upon the carved wooden figurehead of the ship. The salt sting of the sea breeze mixed with the acrid taste of old fires. Once, Valyria had been the cradle of dragon lords, the heart of an empire spanning continents. Once, the Targaryens had walked these shores as lesser nobles overshadowed by the mightiest families in the greatest city the world had known. Then had come the doom, cataclysmic and final. Now no one dwelt here except ghosts and monsters. But Daenerys was no stranger to ruin and resurrection. She had birthed dragons in the ashes of her grief, forging the impossible from the unimaginable. She was unafraid of the old magics, the old secrets. She had come here seeking knowledge, hoping to glean something from the last remnants of Valyria's grandeur that might aid her in her efforts to reclaim the Iron Throne. Yet she found in the pit of her stomach that her mission had become something more. An urge, an instinct older than her reason, drove her forward as if a half-forgotten whisper in her blood said she must walk the broken roads of her ancestral home. A sudden hiss from one of her dragons interrupted her thoughts. Rhaegal's reptilian eyes gleamed in the fitful gloom, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Drogon and Viserion flew overhead, circling warily, scanning the horizon. Even from her vantage, Daenerys glimpsed the spindly silhouettes of towers rising from the water, jagged stone like the teeth of a monstrous jaw. They were close now. She inhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. The hull scraped against something submerged. The sailors grunted but pressed on with their long oars, easing the ship past hidden reefs. Slowly, the city's dark shapes came into clearer view, collapsed buildings and broken marble columns half submerged under the smoking sea. Where once a million souls might have walked proud causeways, serpents of smoke and steam writhed. Some said the fires under the sea still burned, a smoldering heat that never died. Broken aqueducts jutted from the water like giant bones. The devastation was absolute. The anchor plunged with a heavy splash. Daenerys felt the ship settle, rocking gently in the unnatural swells. She turned to Ser Barristan and Selmy's successor, Ser Jorah Mormont, having long been gone, and the next wave of loyal protectors who stood ready on the deck behind her. One was a Dothraki bloodrider, sworn to her after she had united the Khalasars, and another a Braavosi Sellsword, watchful and lithe, ever ready with a quip and a blade. There were a handful more, but no one she truly trusted as she had once trusted Ser Barristan or Ser Jorah. Yet she had come to see that loyalty sometimes came in the form of shared cause rather than unbreakable devotion. These men and women believed in her. She had to believe in them. "Stay vigilant," she said. "We do not know what lurks in these waters." The Dothraki inclined his head, scanning the skies. The Sellsword only nodded, tightening a leather gauntlet. A creaking rowboat was lowered into the water. Daenerys, robed in a cloak of dark material that would not hinder her movement, stepped down into it. The others joined her and they rowed toward a crumbled quay. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion flew at a distance, their presence the only comfort in a place that stank of death. Stepping onto the slick stones, Daenerys found the land spongy with algae and soot. She spotted shards of melted obsidian fused with twisted lumps of metal. Once beautiful mosaic tiles, half-broken and covered in grime, hinted at the city's lost majesty. The main road leading deeper into the ruins lay broken by what might have been a tidal wave of molten rock centuries ago. They proceeded carefully, each step an exercise in caution. The hush of Valyria was so profound that every breath sounded loud. Her guards fanned out, swords drawn, exploring corners, scanning rooftops, half expecting some monstrosity birthed in the doom's aftermath to leap out at them. In hushed voices, they tried to reassure one another that these horrors were only stories, that the real threat might be the shifting ground, the potential for sudden gas eruptions, or unforeseen sinkholes. But Daenerys knew the rumors. The fireworms. The stone men. Spectral illusions. She felt the weight of them. She had come prepared, though. This was not a reckless expedition. She had gleaned as much information as she could from old tomes in Meereen. Then there were the whispered legends from the free cities, where superstitious sailors told of seeing flickers of dragons ghosting through Valyria's ruins. Part of her ached to see it for herself, to walk in the footsteps of her ancestors, to claim something from this broken land that would strengthen her birthright. They pressed on. Decaying structures loomed on either side. The stench of sulfur grew stronger, a warm breeze pushing back her silver-gold hair. She walked at the head of her small band, head held high, body tensed for danger. They were searching for an old library or vault rumored to remain standing. According to a half-crazed sorcerer she had questioned in Volantis, deep within the labyrinth of ruined Valyria lay fragments of arcane lore, maps, genealogies, spells. So many documents had been lost in the Doom, but not all. The sorcerer had sworn on his life that a hidden vault still existed, maintained by wards older than the Targaryens themselves. To Daenerys it sounded fanciful, but she had not dismissed it entirely. She remembered how she had once stood in the House of the Undying, how illusions had swirled around her, unveiling glimpses of the future. Magic existed in this world, and in Valyria it had once flourished. Perhaps some small piece of that magic still remained, and with it knowledge that could grant her a decisive advantage. They wended their way through twisting alleys flanked by collapsed pillars. Overhead, the dragons occasionally swooped in close, stirring the ash into swirling clouds. Her guard 8 strong, not counting those who remained with the ship spread out, scanning ahead and behind. Water dripped from cracks in the stone, and occasionally a jet of steam hissed from an ancient pipe beneath the ground, a reminder that the fires beneath Valyria still burned. Daenerys paused at an ornate archway that somehow stood intact, a survivor amidst the rubble. Ser Darius, a knight of uncertain lineage but unwavering loyalty, pointed at a faint inscription carved into the black stone. She brushed away centuries of soot with her gloved hand and squinted at the worn glyphs. They resembled Valyrian script but elongated, as if shaped by different linguistic conventions centuries before the city's prime. "It must be old," she murmured, "even for Valyria." "Do you read it?" asked Darius. She shook her head. "Not all. I see references to blood and crown, and something about the forging of the world. But it's too eroded." She hesitated, then gestured for them to continue. The courtyard beyond the arch was partially collapsed, opening to what looked like a grand promenade. Half submerged in water, a series of statues lined the path. Some depicted Valyrian dragon lords, their features chipped away to reveal blank eyes. Others showed dragons coiled in magnificent poses. She felt an unearthly reverence, as though she were intruding on a graveyard of kings. They crossed carefully. Stone steps led up to a building whose domed roof, unbelievably, remained mostly intact. A wide crack ran along one side, exposing the interior to the elements. Daenerys felt her pulse quicken. Could this be the vault she'd heard about? She signaled her guards. They advanced slowly. She kept her hand on the hilt of a slim Valyrian steel dagger she carried, one of her few relics from her forebears. Inside, the space was enormous, though half-choked with rubble. Broken shelves slumped against the walls. Tattered remnants of once-rich tapestries hung in disarray. The floor was littered with charred debris, lumps of melted glass, and thick dust that coated everything. A pungent odor of old, stagnant water and something else, perhaps rotting parchment, lingered in the air. Spread out across the shattered floor were the remains of tomes and scrolls, their pages turned to black flakes or dust. Daenerys's heart sank at the sight. So much knowledge gone. So many secrets devoured by flames or time. Carefully, she knelt and picked up a fragment of parchment. Crumbled in her hand. There was no saving it. "Over here," the Braavosi cell's word called from the far side of the building. "I see steps leading downward." She rose and made her way across, her guards flanking her. A wide flight of stone steps descended into darkness, the air colder and damper. She felt a draft rising from the depths, carrying with it a tinge of stale air. If anything survived, it might be below, perhaps sealed away from the worst of the doom. They lit torches, the orange glow dancing over damp walls. At the bottom, they found a thick door banded with some sort of metal. It looked blackened but intact. A sigil of an abstract dragon shape had once been carved into the wood, though it was gouged and partially missing. Ser Darius pushed against the door. It did not budge. 2 more joined him. With a grunt, they heaved together, and finally, under their concerted effort, the door groaned open, revealing a cavernous antechamber. Inside, they found a library or archive of sorts. Unlike the ruins above, This area had suffered less from the flames and falling rubble. Rows of stone shelves stood crookedly, and to Daenerys's amazement, some of the shelves still held scroll tubes and thick codices. The air was thick and musty, but the dryness had possibly preserved these relics. They fanned out, searching for anything that might be legible. Daenerys, breath quickening with excitement, moved among the shelves. Much of the parchment was too fragile to touch. But here and there, she saw metal and clay cylinders, sealed perhaps with wax. If the seal remained intact, perhaps the text inside still survived. Carefully, she lifted one cylinder and shook it gently. Something rustled within. An electric thrill coursed through her. This was real, tangible knowledge. "Your Grace," called a voice from behind a row of shelves. "You'd best see this." Daenerys set the cylinder down, marking its spot in her mind, and stepped carefully around the debris to where the cell's words stood. He pointed his torch into a corner. There, on a squat pedestal of black stone, rested a locked chest adorned with intricate patterns. The lock itself appeared to be made of Valyrian steel, though tarnished with age. Daenerys's eyes narrowed. The chest did not look plundered. Perhaps no one had found it, or if they had, they failed to open it. She glanced at her men. "Can we break it open without destroying its contents?" A small, wiry woman among her entourage, an expert in infiltration and picking locks whom Daenerys had hired in Pentos, stepped forward. "I can try, Your Grace." Daenerys nodded her permission. The woman knelt, examining the lock by torchlight. Gently, she inserted slender picks. For several moments, she coaxed and nudged the mechanism, brow furrowed in concentration. Then there was a click and the lock sprung open. The woman exhaled. "Valyrian steel or not, the internal workings have corroded." Daenerys suppressed a grin. Even in this place, she could find cause for hope. She reached for the chest, slowly lifting the lid. She half expected to set off a trap or find the contents turned to dust. But beneath the lid lay layers of thick cloth, stiff with age. She peeled them back to reveal a large scroll. Alongside it, a slender dagger. At first, Daenerys's eyes went to the dagger, for it was quite beautiful, wrought with a strange swirling pattern in the steel that glinted under the torchlight. But her curiosity about the scroll overcame her. Gently, she took the scroll in both hands. The parchment was stiff and heavy, unlike the brittle fragments scattered around. Perhaps it had been treated in some special way. She carefully unrolled it. The writing was Valyrian, though in archaic form, peppered with glyphs that looked more like dragons' talons than letters. Alongside the text were diagrams, rivers, mountains, shapes that might denote cities or fortresses. It was a map, though not of Essos. The rough outlines seemed to depict Westeros. The shape was recognizable if one looked closely, a narrowing at the neck, a flourish at the southwestern coast. She traced a finger along the coastline. Then her breath caught. There was the north, rendered in faint lines. She saw the shape of a wolf's head drawn near where Winterfell should be. Next to it, in sinuous script, was something like Stark, or as close to the Valyrian interpretation of that name as could be managed. It was difficult to parse. "What is it, Your Grace?" asked Ser Darius. She swallowed. "A map, I think, of Westeros. And here it references the Stark name." She blinked, squinting more. "It mentions something about the origins of the bloodline. A king in the north of an older age. Perhaps the first Stark king or something even older." She sensed the significance. The Targaryens had come from Valyria, but the Stark's domain had always been the north, shaped by legends and secrets as ancient as the Long Night. Why would a map in Valyria reference them in such detail? Why would it be hidden away? The text was cryptic. Phrases leapt at her: blood of winter's hush, forging of pacts, the hidden truth. She felt a strange tingle in her fingertips. She remembered the stories from her youth about the first men, about Bran the Builder, about the Age of Heroes. The Targaryens had found their seat on Dragonstone before Aegon the Conqueror rose to claim the Seven Kingdoms. But the Starks had been in the north for thousands of years, weaving myth and reality into an unbroken lineage. Could the Valyrians have uncovered something about that lineage? Something that might be important to her struggle? A swirl of longing and confusion washed over her. She thought she understood her destiny: to reclaim the Iron Throne and bring peace to Westeros. But something deeper, something older, might be entwined with that destiny. The scroll teased a hidden link, a meeting point between Targaryen heritage and Stark heritage. Softly, she re-rolled the scroll and tucked it under her arm. Then, with careful hands, she lifted the dagger. It was cool to the touch. An eerie symbol etched into the hilt showed a dragon entwined with a wolf. She had never seen such an emblem before. It astonished her that it existed at all, an artifact that joined two of Westeros's oldest houses in a single motif. Her mind spun. The Targaryen dragons and the Stark direwolves had rarely been allied. The Starks had knelt to Aegon, yes, but they had been cautious, proud protectors of the North. Yet here, from Valyria itself, came a suggestion of something older, a connection that might date back centuries or millennia before the Doom. She looked at her retinue, sensing their curiosity and unease. "We have what we need," she said. "Gather anything else that might be of value, but quickly. We cannot linger here too long." They nodded. Under her direction, they carefully searched for more sealed scroll tubes or codices that looked intact. A few more items were found. A bronze disc etched with more cryptic symbols. A small coffer of valuables that might have been an offering of some kind. When Daenerys was satisfied, they made their way back outside, lugging their finds. The city's shadows had shifted. Perhaps an hour or more had passed. Daenerys breathed in the still oppressive air. A swirl of smoke from beneath the streets drifted across the broken walkway. She beckoned her dragons down from the sky. Drogon landed on a half-toppled spire, his claws scraping the stone. Rhaegal and Viserion soon joined him, watchful as ever. They retraced their steps to the quay. The rowboat bobbed at the edge of the ruined dock, and the horizon had grown darker still as day neared its end. Daenerys directed the return to the ship. A part of her felt an urge to explore more, to scour every corner of Valyria. But that would be madness. They had found the vault, they had retrieved this curious artifact, and they still had the hazardous journey back across the smoking sea. She needed no more curses or cataclysms to befall them. The crew was relieved when she returned safely. Even the bravest among them had felt the oppressive dread of Valyria's cursed waters. The anchor was raised, and the sails unfurled, carrying them away from the ruined kingdom of her ancestors. Daenerys stood at the stern, the ancient scroll clutched in her arms, and watched the blackened spires sink into the smoky haze behind them. She wondered if she would ever return. And if she did, would she find the city unchanged, waiting like a patient ghost? Valyria had once been the seat of her kin's power, but that seat was no more. Now there might be another secret seat of power hidden in the north waiting for her to uncover. She would find a way to decipher the text, no matter what it cost. In the days and weeks that followed, she pored over the scroll whenever she had the chance. Since departing Meereen, her forces had dwindled. She had loyal Unsullied, some Dothraki, and a few followers who believed she would still claim Westeros as her own. She'd faced setbacks, betrayals, heartbreak. But she pressed on, her gaze fixed westward. Now the scroll offered a new puzzle. The archaic Valyrian was difficult even for her. She possessed some knowledge of High Valyrian, enough to speak and read it decently, but the script was older, laced with esoteric references. She could discern fragments of meaning, references to a tomb beneath ice, a crown of black iron, and a bond of fire and snow. The map itself indicated a region far north of Winterfell, deep into the land of permanent frost, near the Fist of the First Men, or possibly even beyond the Wall. She could not be certain. The lines were stylized, the text cryptic. Yet she felt sure it was referencing the Stark line in some capacity, an origin story that spoke of forging alliances in an age-long past, possibly even during the long night when the White Walkers first threatened humanity. She turned the dagger over in her hands more than once, reflecting on its significance. The swirling steel had a faint iridescent quality, as if it were alive with some dormant magic. She sometimes caught her reflection in it and felt a surge of determination. If this was truly a relic from that ancient era, it might prove critical in her struggles. Her next challenge was to find someone who could help her decipher the text fully. She had skill with languages, but she was not a scholar of pre-Doom Valyria. Many such experts had died or refused to risk the wrath of the more powerful factions that opposed her. Yet she could think of one group who might still aid her, the Maesters of the Citadel in Old Town. But she doubted they would welcome her easily. An exiled Targaryen with dragons, rumored to bring war. Or perhaps there was another alternative. The free folk or the few learned individuals in the north who might hold legends passed down from generation to generation. Her plan to sail for Westeros remained. But now her path might differ from what she had once envisioned. She would not simply land her armies in King's Landing and unleash fire. She needed answers in the north. She needed to understand what these cryptic references meant, and whether forging an alliance with House Stark, or what remained of it, was part of her destiny. With these thoughts swirling in her mind, Daenerys pressed forward. The crossing to Westeros was not without peril, but her dragons had grown formidable. They soared above the waves, watchful for any threat. When at last the shores of Dorne rose in the distance, Daenerys felt a great wave of relief. But she did not plan to remain in Dorne. She did not want to be mired in petty skirmishes or weigh herself down with the complexities of local politics. Not yet. Quietly and swiftly, with the help of those lords still sympathetic to a Targaryen claim, she resupplied, ensuring no open announcements of her arrival were made. A small retinue accompanied her on the next leg of the journey, northward by sea. In the eyes of many, it might seem madness for Daenerys Targaryen to sail directly to the north rather than march on King's Landing first. But she had a sense of urgency gnawing at her. The old magic was stirring. Winter was upon the land, the nights growing longer and colder. She felt an echo in her bones, as if the dragons themselves wanted to soar over snowy fields and see what lay hidden beyond the wall. She also remembered the warnings she had heard about the undead threat in the far north. Stories that once seemed mere legend were repeated more frequently now. Some hailed Jon Snow, a rumored king in the north, who had faced horrors beyond imagining. Would he trust her? Would he help her decipher the map that might concern his own ancestry? She wondered if he even knew of these old ties that bound Targaryen and Stark blood together, if only in ancient myth. They rounded the coast, the salt wind biting at their faces as they sailed toward White Harbor. Daenerys stood on deck, her hair braided and pinned to keep it from whipping about too wildly. She gazed at the diminishing southern sun. The light came at an angle, painting the clouds in dusky oranges and purples. Soon they would dock. A delicate dance of diplomacy awaited her. House Manderly held White Harbor, and rumors suggested they were loyal to the Starks. If the Starks were still in power in the north, if there was indeed a king in the north, she would likely have to treat with him. She cradled the scroll under her cloak, unwilling to let it out of her sight. She had read it dozens of times, gleaning new hints of meaning with each pass. The text was like an incantation, referencing a time when the sun fled the sky for a generation, when the winds howled like hungry wolves and an army of the dead marched. It spoke of a prince with burning blood who joined with a queen of sorrows, Frost, to turn back the darkness. Some lines suggested this was the forging point of a new era, a bond that sealed the fate of dragons and dire wolves for centuries to come. Daenerys's heart pounded each time she read it, haunted by the sense of prophecy. They arrived at White Harbor under cover of twilight. Her followers disembarked quietly. House Manderly's men were understandably suspicious to see ships bearing the Targaryen sigil approaching unannounced. But a quick dispatch explained that the Dragon Queen sought parley, not invasion. Daenerys refused to flaunt her full might here, no massed unsullied columns, no Dothraki hordes pillaging the countryside. She arrived with a small honor guard, though her dragons soared overhead, monstrous silhouettes in the moonlight. That alone was enough to ensure caution from any who doubted her word. A tense welcome awaited her in the outer courtyard of New Castle, the seat of House Manderly. The portly but sharp-eyed Lord Wyman Manderly, rumored to have recovered from a series of intrigues during the wars that plagued Westeros, approached. His doublet displayed a white merman upon a turquoise field. His expression was guarded. He bowed with practiced courtesy, though whether it was out of genuine respect or political necessity, Daenerys could not say. "Your Grace," he said, eyeing her dragons perched on the battlements with unease. "An unexpected honor. We are not accustomed to receiving Targaryen royals in White Harbor." She inclined her head. "Lord Manderly, I come in peace. I seek an audience with the king in the north." His mustache twitched. "That would be Lord Stark if rumors hold true. Aye, we have a king in the north once more. Jon Snow, the White Wolf, they call him." Though some say he trailed off, an uncertain look in his eyes, as if he knew more than he dared to share. "He is presently at Winterfell." "And how does he fare?" Daenerys asked. "As well as a man can in these troubled times," said Manderly. "Winter deepens, your grace. The road to Winterfell grows perilous." "I must see him," she said firmly. "I have urgent business in the north that cannot wait." A flicker of surprise moved across his face. "Then you will have the hospitality of White Harbor for as long as you need to prepare." In the days that followed, Daenerys gathered her retinue, carefully stabled her dragons in a large clearing outside the city walls where the Manderleys begrudgingly allowed them to roost, and made ready for the journey to Winterfell. The rumors that reached her ears worried her. Undead whites spotted near the wall, the Night's Watch preparing for a conflict unlike any in living memory, and the North rallying behind Jon Snow in anticipation of a greater threat. She felt the lines of the scroll weigh on her mind. If the old tales were returning, if the White Walkers were truly stirring, then the knowledge she'd brought from Valyria might be more critical than ever. Despite the harsh winter conditions, Daenerys insisted on traveling by land. She wanted to see the North firsthand, and she sensed that riding her dragons in full view might alarm the populace. A smaller company moved faster anyway. She wore furs lined with wolfskin gifted by one of her northern supporters. The irony was not lost on her. A Targaryen clad in wolf fur, traveling to meet the king in the north with a map from Valyria referencing the Stark line. She wondered if the old gods were laughing. The journey took them over frozen roads. Snowdrifts piled high against rocky outcroppings. Each night, they camped near a sheltered spot, building fires against the biting cold. Daenerys grew to respect the North's relentless winter, and she marveled at the quiet majesty of the landscape. This was a far cry from the scorched deserts of Essos or the balmy coasts of the Narrow Sea. Here, the wind howled with an otherworldly note, and the night sky glittered with sharp, cold stars. At last, they crested a hill and beheld the gray walls of Winterfell in the distance. Smoke rose from its chimneys into the ashen sky. The fortress had endured centuries, battered by wars and winter storms. Daenerys felt her heart tighten. She was not sure what welcome she would receive. She was the blood of the dragon. They were the wolves of the north. Her dragons soared overhead, announcing her presence to the keep below. The gates of Winterfell opened, revealing a gathering of guards in stark livery. At their heads stood a man of lean build, dark hair, and a solemn expression. Jon Snow, though by some accounts, he was as much a Targaryen as she. The rumors had reached her, Rhaegar Targaryen's hidden heir, if the stories were true. Could this man be her own blood? The notion stirred a swirl of thoughts she had not yet resolved. She forced her features to remain calm, regal, as she approached astride a graceful white horse. She could see the tension in Jon's stance as she dismounted. He wore simple leathers and furs, the Stark sigil on his chest. His dark eyes flicked to her dragons overhead, then returned to her. She saw caution there, and curiosity, and something else she could not name. A ghost of sorrow, perhaps, from the burdens he carried. She understood that weight well. He inclined his head. "Your Grace. Welcome to Winterfell." She bowed slightly, showing respect but not subservience. "Thank you, Your Grace. I apologize for arriving unannounced. But my business is urgent." Jon's mouth tightened. "So I've heard. Come inside. The cold is no place for talk." They entered the courtyard, Daenerys' retinue behind her. Northerners paused in their tasks to stare at the newcomers. A Targaryen queen, accompanied by brazen warriors and overshadowed by dragons, perched along the parapets. She felt their gazes like the prick of needles. Yet no one challenged her openly. The king in the north had bid them enter, and so they would be treated with caution, if not welcome. Once inside the great hall, warmth enveloped them. Fires burned in wide hearths, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Jon Snow moved to the high seat at the center of the hall, though it was far less ostentatious than the thrones she had seen in Essos. It was a seat carved of simple wood, draped in pelts, the direwolf banner hanging overhead. The hall was sparsely populated. Only a handful of his advisors, men and women who shared his rule of the north. Some eyes glinted with suspicion, others with curiosity. Daenerys stood before him, drawing herself upright. She felt the weight of her quest. She spoke clearly. "I have come to the north in search of answers. I found a map in the ruins of Valyria, an ancient document that references the lineage of House Stark and something hidden in the far north. The text suggests a secret older than the Seven Kingdoms, possibly tied to the White Walkers and the Long Night." She sensed the ripple of unease among Jon's advisors. White Walkers were no mere legend in these halls. She chose her words carefully. "I do not come to claim the North or to challenge your sovereignty here, Jon Snow. I come to find what this scroll references, and I believe we share a common cause, to defend the realm against the threat rising in the far north. If my dragons can aid you, they shall. But first, we must find what is hidden." Jon studied her, his face inscrutable. Then he nodded slowly. I have faced the dead. I know what's coming. If you can help, I will not turn you away. But I must know more about this map. Will you show it to me? She lifted her chin. Of course. With a gesture, she produced the scroll from inside her cloak, carefully unrolling it on a nearby table. Jon stepped down from the dais, as did several of his most trusted companions. Daenerys recognized some faces from the rumors. A red-haired woman with a keen, regal bearing, Sansa Stark, likely his sister or cousin. A tall warrior woman in armor of pale sapphire, Brienne of Tarth, if memory served. A slender young girl with dark eyes that seemed to hold a wealth of experience. Arya Stark, who Daenerys had heard was a skilled fighter. They gathered around. She pointed to the stylized outline of the north. The script is archaic Valyrian, but I can read parts of it. It speaks of a tomb beneath ice, beyond the warmth of any sun. It references a first king or the origin of your line. There is mention of a forging, an alliance or a pact, between fire and ice in an age when darkness covered the land. It implies that something was left behind, a weapon or a crown. The words are ambiguous, but I sense its power. Jon's gaze flickered across the page. And you came all this way? To help us find it? She answered without hesitation. To help us all, Jon Snow. If the White Walkers are as real as I have heard, and you have seen, then we need every advantage we can muster. My dragons are one such advantage, but perhaps there is another. A relic hidden somewhere in the far north, once forged by your ancestors and mine, or so this suggests. She hesitated, her breath hitching. And there is something else. A symbol that unites the dragon and the wolf. Gently, she took out the dagger she had found in the chest. The swirling steel caught the firelight. She heard faint gasps from the onlookers as they saw the forging upon the hilt. A dragon intertwined with a wolf, as if in harmony. Sansa spoke then, her voice quiet but firm. I've never seen anything like that. Have you, Jon? He shook his head, eyes fixed on the blade. No, but it looks old. Very old. A hush fell as they all regarded this artifact. Daenerys saw the flicker in Jon's eyes. Something that resembled awe, or perhaps fear of the unknown. They were each guided by destinies shaped by prophecies they scarcely understood. Finally, Jon exhaled. We have legends, half forgotten. My father, Lord Eddard Stark, did not speak much of the Age of Heroes, but we grew up on tales of Bran the Builder, the King of Winter, and the Long Night. If there is something out there that might help us defeat the White Walkers, we need to find it. But the lands beyond the wall are vast, and the cold is brutal. We can't search blindly. Arya stepped forward, tapping the map with a gloved finger. What about the free folk, the wildlings? Some of them have traveled farther north than any of us. They know hidden valleys and passed through the Frostfangs. Maybe one of their elders has heard a similar legend. Jon rubbed his jaw. Tormund Giantsbane is at Eastwatch by the sea with the bulk of the wildlings who survived. I can send for him or we can travel there. Daenerys cleared her throat. I am willing to go wherever is necessary. But the time is short. Winter is here. The White Walkers march. Jon's gaze lifted to meet hers. She saw the steel in him, the unspoken resolve. He nodded. Then we do not delay. Tomorrow we'll make arrangements for a journey to Eastwatch. We'll consult with the free folk, gather what we can, and if this leads us farther north, so be it. We'll go. A breath Daenerys did not realize she'd been holding escaped her. She glanced around at the gathered northerners. A swirl of conflicting emotions lay on their faces. Fear of the unknown, suspicion of this Targaryen queen, but also a flicker of hope. She could work with hope. Thus began their uneasy alliance. In the days that followed, Daenerys' presence at Winterfell stirred talk and rumor. Some lords questioned the wisdom of allowing dragons within their walls, while others looked upon her in wonder, remembering half-forgotten stories of the last Targaryens to cross the neck. Daenerys herself took solace in the cold godswood, walking among the ancient weirwood branches that stood silent and snow-laden. She did not pray to these old gods, yet she felt their watchful presence, as though the land itself had eyes. She spent hours conversing with Jon Snow and his advisors, pooling knowledge about the White Walkers and the state of the realm. King's Landing was in turmoil, rumors swirling of Lannister plots of chaos in the south. But Jon insisted that the true war was in the north against an enemy that did not care about mortal politics. She believed him. Occasionally, she shared with him more lines from the scroll seeking his input. He admitted that some references reminded him of the legends surrounding the Night King, or the building of the wall, or how House Stark had once been rumored to guard a secret Kings of Winter crypt deep beneath Winterfell. One night, he took her by torchlight to see the crypts himself, long tunnels lined with stone effigies of past Stark lords. The air was still, dust motes drifting in the torchlight. Daenerys shivered as she passed under the gaze of ancient stone dire wolves, each perched at the feet of a carved Stark figure. She couldn't help but notice how many men bore the name Brandon, the face of each statue carved in stony repose. She wondered if any of them knew of the secrets the Valyrians had once recorded. "This place humbles me," Daenerys admitted, voice echoing softly in the gloom. "My line came to Westeros and conquered with dragons. But your line has guarded these lands for centuries untold." Jon was quiet a moment. "My father, Lord Eddard, used to say we all have our duties. The North's was to stand strong against anything that threatened the realm. The Targaryens had theirs, too, once upon a time. Maybe we need to stand together now." She glanced at him, the torchlight playing over his solemn features. For a moment, she imagined a bond forming between them, not just of convenience or necessity, but of shared purpose. She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against the chilled stone hilt of a sword that lay across the lap of some ancient Stark. "Yes," she whispered. "We stand together, or we fall." When they emerged from the crypts, a sense of inevitability coiled in Daenerys's chest. The days were moving quickly, each moment bringing them closer to a confrontation with the undead. She could almost sense the chill of the others creeping through the night. Her dragons felt it, too. They were restless, prowling the skies and raking the frosted ground with their claws. Something was coming. Soon enough, the call to depart came. A message from Eastwatch by the Sea arrived, reporting sightings of White Walkers near the coast. Tormund Giantsbane urged Jon to come quickly. The free folk had found a cave painting that might match the symbols Daenerys described, something depicting men kneeling before strange figures in the midst of swirling shapes representing winter storms. The sense of urgency pressed on them. Jon and Daenerys led a small party north, traveling by horse through bitter wind. The main bulk of the northern forces remained at Winterfell, preparing defenses. This was a scouting mission, one that relied on speed and stealth rather than an army's might. They had capable fighters among them, the Lady Brienne, agile and stoic, the Quicksilver Arya, whose eyes seemed to miss nothing. The red-haired Lady Sansa stayed behind to govern in Jon's absence, though Daenerys caught the reluctance in her eyes as she bade them farewell. They rode for days, the snowdrifts deepening. With them came a handful of wildlings who had joined them at Winterfell, guiding them across frozen rivers and through hidden passes. Each night, they camped under black skies ablaze with cold stars, the howling wind rattling their tents. Sometimes Daenerys soared overhead on Drogon, scouting the terrain. Her face numbed by the cutting air, she peered down at the endless white expanse, searching for signs of movement. She saw little beyond the swirl of snow. But one evening, as they neared Eastwatch, she glimpsed something that made her blood run cold, a far-off shape in the snow moving in unnatural synchrony. She dived lower, heart-pounding, certain she had seen Whites, an undead patrol, perhaps. Thankfully, it was distant and did not seem to notice her, or perhaps it had no means to attack a dragon at such a height. Nevertheless, the sight confirmed the urgency of their mission. At last, they reached Eastwatch, the easternmost stronghold of the Night's Watch. A squat fortress perched at the edge of the sea, battered by icy winds and crashing waves. Tormund Giantsbane, as broad and red-bearded as she had been told, greeted Jon with a fierce hug, ignoring titles. Then he turned his curious gaze on Daenerys, eyeing her with a mixture of respect and wariness. They settled in a dim hall near a roaring fire. Tormund recounted what the Free Folk Scouts had seen, large pockets of undead roaming the tundra, White Walkers leading them with eerie silence. Then he described a cave painting found inside a newly revealed ice cavern along the coast. "I know nothing of reading old signs," Tormund admitted, stroking his beard. "But the shapes, the pictures, it's like what Jon told me once about the children of the forest and the first men. And there's a marking that looks like a man with the head of a wolf standing beside a figure with the head of a dragon." Daenerys felt her pulse spike. This echoed the dagger's symbol, the swirl of the scroll. Jon nodded grimly. "We need to see it." The next morning, they rode to the coast where the sea had frozen into jagged sheets near the shore. The Free Folk Scouts guided them to an unassuming crevice in the icy cliffs. Inside, the cavern opened into a labyrinth of ice tunnels, glittering faintly in the subdued light of their torches. The cold bit at Daenerys's nose and cheeks. She and Jon led the way, with Tormund and Brienne close behind. Eventually, they emerged into a wide chamber with a high ceiling of pale blue ice. Torchlight flickered across the walls, revealing ancient carvings. Daenerys's breath caught in her throat. The style was primitive, reminiscent of those she had seen drawn by the children of the forest in the caves near Dragonstone, though she had only heard second-hand accounts of that. Here, swirling lines depicted great battles against creatures with pale, inhuman faces. In one section, a tall figure with what appeared to be a dragon's wings stood beside a figure with a wolf's head. Between them, a stylized sun rose, pushing back a dark storm filled with skeletal shapes. Jon approached, raising his torch higher. "The Age of Heroes," he murmured. When the first men and the children of the forest stood against the long night, Daenerys touched the ice, feeling the chill. Her mind raced to connect these images with the text of the scroll. "They forged something," she said quietly. "A bond. Perhaps a weapon, or a crown, or both." She trailed off, recalling the line from the scroll referencing a crown of black iron. As if in response, Tormund lifted his torch to another section of wall. The carving there showed a circular band around the head of the wolfman figure, with lines radiating outward like small flames. Next to it, the dragon figure held a sword that seemed to glow. Daenerys felt a chill run deeper than the cold air. A sword of burning light. A crown with flames. The scroll's references to forging an alliance began to align in her thoughts. Jon turned to her, dark eyes intense. If such a crown or sword still exists, it might lie in the crypts of Winterfell or somewhere beyond the wall, lost to time. But the scroll points farther north, doesn't it? She nodded. Yes. It suggests the site of some ancient forging is beyond the boundaries of any known settlement. A place of ice and darkness. He exhaled, a plume of breath in the cold air. That means going beyond the wall, deeper into the territory the dead now roam. We'll have to be careful, but if this is real, it could be what we need. A symbol or a power to unite us all, fire and ice. He glanced at her dragons, which waited outside the cavern's entrance, too large to fit through the tunnels. She felt the tug of fear. The undead were out there in increasing numbers. Even her dragons might be at risk if they were outnumbered. But the scroll, the carvings, everything pointed to the necessity of this journey. They could not falter now. The living needed every advantage in the war against death. Thus, the next phase of their quest was decided. A small contingent would venture beyond the wall under cover of the dragons. Jon, Daenerys, and select others, those strong of will and skilled in arms. They would seek the location indicated by the scroll or as close as they could approximate from its cryptic references. They would rely on scouting from the sky to avoid large pockets of whites. And if they found whatever relic, crown, sword, or otherwise, they would bring it back to rally the living. Before they departed, Daenerys took a moment of solitude on a snowy bluff overlooking the frozen sea. The wind whipped her hair around, and she drew her cloak tight. She thought of all that had led her here, the struggles in Essos, the burden of her Targaryen heritage, the discovery in Valyria. The notion that a secret bond between House Targaryen and House Stark stretched back into the mists of time both comforted and unsettled her. Had her forebears known of this? Had they chosen to forget it? She rested her hand on the dagger's hilt. The swirl of the wolf and dragon reminded her that destinies might intertwine in ways no one expected. She pictured Jon Snow's solemn eyes, the slow burn of trust that she sensed developing between them. Here in the savage cold, she found a warmth she had not known since the distant days of her time with Khal Drogo, an ally she could rely on without the constant fear of betrayal. An equal. Perhaps more than an equal if the rumors of his parentage were true. But those thoughts would have to wait. The dead marched, and all living needed to unite. She looked up at the heavens, the sky a pearly gray. Somewhere beyond the cold horizon lay an ancient secret waiting to be claimed. Their preparations complete, they set out from Eastwatch, pushing into the tundra beyond the wall. The dragons circled overhead, scouting for threats. Jon led the ground team, Daenerys by his side, accompanied by Tormund, Brienne, Arya, and a few other hardened warriors who had volunteered. Each morning, they advanced, forging a path through snowdrifts taller than a man. Each night, they made camp in the shelter of rocky outcroppings, keeping watch in shifts. The wind's mournful wail filled Daenerys's ears, fraying her nerves. The cold seemed to bite deeper with each passing day. They found evidence of the dead, tracks in the snow, half-burned bodies that had not yet risen, shattered bones near a ravaged campsite. Once, in a twilight gloom, a small group of whites lunged at them from behind an icy ridge. The dragons descended in a fury of fire, incinerating the undead in a heartbeat, but the encounter rattled everyone. There could be more, many more. Daenerys clutched the scroll when they paused to rest, checking their heading. The stylized lines were not precise cartography, but they gave a rough sense of direction. She estimated they needed to travel another day or two, possibly more. Time blurred in the endless white. On the second night, they beheld shimmering lights in the sky, the aurora dancing in ethereal colors across the darkness. Daenerys stood outside her tent, enraptured by the display. Beside her, Jon watched silently, arms folded against the colt. She wondered if he'd seen such lights before. Perhaps in his time with the Night's Watch or during earlier forays beyond the wall. "It's beautiful," she murmured, voice hushed. Jon nodded. "A rare beauty in a dangerous land." She turned to him, the cold stinging her cheeks. "I never imagined I'd stand here, so far from the warmth of the South. So far from the life I once knew." His eyes flicked over her face, intense. "Nor did I imagine I'd ally with a Targaryen. Yet here we are. The world changes around us." Their gazes held a moment longer, a silent understanding passing between them. Then a shout from one of the lookouts broke the moment. Daenerys's heart jumped, fearing the dead had come again. But it was only a lone figure stumbling through the snow toward their camp, a wildling scout. He collapsed at their feet, half-frozen and gasping. "I found a cave not far. Strange shapes, someone or something protecting it." They helped him to the fire, gave him hot broth. He described the location as best he could, an opening in the side of a glacier ringed by jagged ice. He'd seen figures, blue-eyed whites or worse, lurking near the entrance. He dared not go closer. Daenerys and Jon exchanged a look. This could be it. The place the map pointed to. Or at least something close. That night, they planned their approach. At first light, they would move carefully with the dragons overhead, ready to scorch any threat. If the dead had made a nest around the entrance, it was a sign something significant lay within. Dawn came, gray and bleak. They set out. Daenerys flew ahead on Drogon while Rhaegal carried Jon. Valyria circled, carrying no rider but following Drogon's lead. From the sky, Daenerys soon spotted the glacier described. Indeed, whites milled around an icy cleft, a dozen or more. Among them, she saw pale figures with glowing blue eyes and ornate ice spears. White walkers. She sucked in a breath, steeling herself. This was no simple scouting party. This was a guard. Something they deemed worth guarding. She glanced over at Jon astride Rhaegal, and their eyes met. She nodded. Without hesitation, she and Jon dived down, unleashing the dragon's fury. Drogon's roar split the air, a jet of fire incinerating the whites below. Rhaegal spewed flames, scattering the undead. Some whites shrieked and burned, staggering aimlessly as the dragon fire consumed them. The White Walkers themselves stepped back, brandishing their spears. Viserion swooped low, but a spear of ice hurled by one of the walkers shattered against his flank. The dragon roared in pain, though the spear had not penetrated deeply. Daenerys's heart pounded. This was dangerous. She had seen the power the walkers wielded, how a single spear could bring down a dragon if it struck true. She let Drogon hover higher, raining fire. She had to annihilate them quickly. The heat of Dragon's breath melted and splintered the ice, sending steam billowing. Some White Walkers dodged the flames with uncanny speed. Jon guided Rhaegal into another pass, unleashing a torrent of fire that reduced one walker to shards of swirling ice. But the others raised their weapons, forming a defensive ring around the cave entrance. On the ground, Brienne, Tormund, Arya, and the others who had advanced on foot engaged whites that had scattered from the main group. Steel clashed against undead flesh. Daenerys spotted flashes of Valyrian steel in Arya's hands, dispatching whites with deadly precision. Seizing an opening, Daenerys urged Drogon to descend. His gargantuan claws crushed several whites, and his roar shook the air. She leapt down from the saddle, landing in the slush, dagger in hand. Her heart hammered. This was rash, but the chance presented itself. She advanced on one White Walker from behind as it braced against Rhaegal's next pass. The swirling steel of her dagger glinted in the pallid light. The walker sensed her too late. Before it could turn fully, she drove the dagger into its back. A shriek filled the air, unearthly and piercing, as the walker's body cracked and dissolved into a swirl of ice crystals. Daenerys staggered back, the force of the scream echoing in her bones. The moment of triumph was short-lived. Another White Walker charged her, ice spear raised. She barely dodged, the spear's blade grazing her shoulder, sending a shock of cold through her. She stumbled, pain lancing down her arm. Drogon hissed, trying to angle his head to blast the walker, but Daenerys was too close and the risk of friendly fire was high. A surge of black fur blurred past her. Ghost, a massive white dire wolf, or so it seemed at first. But no, this was Nymeria, Arya's wolf, or another pack. She heard snarling, recognized the swirl of savage canines. The wolf lunged at the walker, knocking its aim aside. Daenerys found her footing, brandished the dagger once more. She plunged the blade into the walker's exposed flank. Another shriek. Another swirl of ice. Then it was gone. The dagger's swirling steel glowed faintly, as if hungry for the undead essence it consumed. Daenerys clutched her shoulder, panting. The wound bled, but it was shallow. She looked around the battlefield. With the dragon's fire and the Valyrian steel in her allies' hands, the undead stood little chance. The last of the whites burned or were cut down. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of melting ice and the labored breaths of the living. Jon landed nearby, dismounting regal with practiced grace, running to Daenerys' side. "You're hurt." She shook her head. "It's nothing. I'm fine." Adrenaline coursed through her. She gestured at the cave. "We need to go in, see what they were protecting." He nodded, eyes flicking to her bloodied shoulder. Concern etched in his expression. But they pressed on. Inside, the glacier's tunnel sloped downward. Frost glittered on every surface. Daenerys and Jon led the way, torches in hand. The others followed, watchful and silent. If more whites lurked within, they would have to fight in cramped quarters. Yet they found no more undead. Instead, they reached a cavern lined with ice as smooth as glass. At its center stood a raised dais of dark stone, incongruous in the pristine white surroundings. Daenerys' breath caught. She could feel the presence of something, like a low hum that resonated in her bones. On that dais rested a crown, wrought of black metal. Its shape was simple yet imposing. A narrow band with small protrusions like stylized flames and icicles interwoven. Even under the torchlight, it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Jon stepped toward it slowly. Daenerys recalled the scroll's words. A crown of black iron, forged in the union of fire and ice. She could almost hear the echo of ancient Valyrian incantations, as if this object carried the weight of centuries. Jon reached out, not quite touching the metal, as if it might burn him. Brienne and Tormund hung back, wary. Arya hovered near the entrance, scanning the darkness. Daenerys approached Jon's side. Her shoulder throbbed, but she ignored it. She stared at the crown, at the faint swirl of runes along its surface. They reminded her of the ones she'd seen in Valyria, combined with the swirling glyphs she'd glimpsed in the cave carvings near Eastwatch. A union of cultures long lost. "Is this it?" Jon asked, his voice hushed. "The forging the scroll spoke of?" Daenerys nodded. "I believe so. A relic from the Age of Heroes, left here to seal the pact, perhaps. Fire and ice, Targaryen and Stark, or dragon and wolf. I'm not sure. But it carries a power. I can feel it." Cautiously, Jon lifted the crown, cradling it in his gloved hands. The metal seemed to faintly pulse with an inner cold. Daenerys placed a hand atop his, steadying him. She felt a jolt, as if lightning raced up her arm. Jon inhaled sharply, clearly experiencing the same sensation. Then it subsided, leaving only a lingering tingle in her fingertips. "We should take it back," Daenerys said, voice trembling slightly. "If this can unite the living, if it can signal that the North and the Targaryens stand as one, maybe that's the sign we need." Jon's dark eyes flicked to hers. "And if it has another power? Against the dead?" She let out a breath. "Then we must discover how to wield it. Perhaps the Citadel would know, or the children of the forest if any remain. But first, we survive. We bring it to Winterfell and let the realm see the wolf and the dragon have aligned." He nodded, resolute. Carefully, he set the crown in a fur-lined pouch to carry it. Together, they turned from the dais, rejoining their companions. The tension in the cavern eased. They had found the relic the White Walkers guarded so fiercely. A sign that it mattered, that it threatened their plans. They emerged back into the pale daylight, blinking at the glare off the snow. Their dragons waited, steaming nostrils flaring. Brienne, Tormund, and Arya stood ready, forming a protective circle. No undead stirred nearby. For the moment, the threat was gone. And so they began the journey southward once more, the black crown in their possession. Daenerys felt a renewed sense of purpose despite the ache in her shoulder. She had come to Valyria seeking knowledge and found a path that led her to the north, to an alliance with Jon Snow, and now to the discovery of an ancient relic that might save them all. This was more than conquest. This was destiny, forging a bond of fire and ice that transcended the petty battles of lords and kings. In her quieter moments, Daenerys wondered what the future held for her personally. The Targaryen claim, the Iron Throne, all of it now seemed secondary to the war for the living. Yet she sensed that if they survived the onslaught of the dead, they could reshape Westeros together in a new image, one that honored both the dragon and the wolf, just as the old relic had once prophesied. As they rode back toward Eastwatch, the dragons overhead like a protective skyward wall, Daenerys felt the warmth of hope stirring in her chest. The first step had been taken. She and Jon had retrieved the crown that might unify the realm, might serve as a symbol of their combined strength. They had risked their lives, tested their faith in each other, and emerged victorious. But she also knew that the real test was yet to come. The White Walkers advanced, winter deepened, and the land groaned under the threat of endless night. She would need all her courage, all her dragons, and all the alliance she could forge with Jon Snow and his people. And beyond that, there was still the question of how the rest of Westeros would react. The Southern Lords might see her alliance with the North as a threat to their power. Cersei Lannister, if she still sat the Iron Throne, would not yield easily. Yet none of that mattered if the dead won. For now, the living had but one enemy, the encroaching darkness of the Night King and his legion. Daenerys tightened her grip on Drogon's reins as she flew. She vowed silently to do whatever it took to save the realm, to protect these people who had suffered so much. If the scroll was true, if that ancient forging of fire and ice had once saved mankind, then perhaps history would repeat itself. Perhaps she and Jon, together, would be the flame that held back the night. She only hoped they had enough time. The flight back to Eastwatch felt shorter, their spirits buoyed by success. But Daenerys could not shake the feeling that the others had allowed them to escape too easily. The White Walkers they faced were but a fraction of the army that lay beyond the horizon. The real battle would not be won in secret caves but on the fields of ice and at the very gates of Winterfell. The crown they carried might rally hearts and minds, but hearts and minds were no match for an unstoppable horde. They would need strategy, alliances, and sacrifice. Still, she kept her gaze forward. The memory of Valyria glimmered in her mind, that haunted place where she had discovered the scroll. Now she saw that her journey had begun even earlier, at her own rebirth in the flames with her dragons, at her desperate fight to free Slavers Bay. Every hardship had shaped her for this moment. She was meant to stand against the darkness as a Targaryen once had, side by side with a Stark. When they reached Eastwatch, they found the garrison abuzz with rumors of more whites in the area. Jon conferred urgently with Tormund and the Night's Watch. Daenerys used that moment to have her wound properly dressed by a skilled healer. The spear's graze had left a fierce bruise and the cold had not helped. Once bandaged, she rejoined the group. They decided to make haste to Winterfell to place the crown in the Stark crypts or in some safe location. Then the Lords of the North could gather, see the Alec, and hopefully unite more strongly under Jon's leadership and Daenerys's cause. A message was sent to call the bannermen to muster as many swords as possible. Word was also sent south to any who would listen, the dead come and the living must stand together. Daenerys was under no illusion that all the Southern Lords would heed the call. Many still likely doubted the existence of White Walkers or feared the Targaryen name. But perhaps enough would come. Perhaps enough believed in the king in the north. And so Daenerys Targaryen found herself returning to Winterfell, a place that had come to symbolize not just the Stark legacy but the fragile hope of humanity itself. As they rode through the gates, the wind carried the promise of a coming storm. She spotted Sansa Stark waiting in the courtyard, her face as serene as fresh snow, yet her eyes betraying a swirl of emotion. The crowd murmured as Daenerys and Jon dismounted. In a solemn gathering in the great hall, they presented the black crown. Gasps and whispers spread among the northern lords. Sansa, her composure flawless, approached to examine it. Bran Stark, mysterious and distant as ever, observed from his seat near the fire, his eyes unnervingly calm. "It's older than any records," he said softly. "I can see echoes of it in my visions in the Age of Heroes. Fire and ice, forging one realm. A pact to stop the Night's King." His words lingered in the hush. Daenerys felt a chill. If Bran could truly see the past, he might hold the key to unlocking the crown's power. Jon lifted the relic. "We found this guarded by White Walkers beyond the wall. They did not want us to have it. That alone should tell you its value. This symbol unites Targaryen and Stark, forging the alliance we need to survive the coming war." He glanced at Daenerys. "We stand together, or we die." Daenerys let her gaze sweep the hall. The eyes of the north were upon her, judging her. Once, the Targaryens had come to conquer with fire and blood. Now she came to join in battle against a foe that threatened all. Slowly, she lowered herself to one knee beside Jon, a symbolic gesture. A hush fell, sharper than the winter wind. "I swear, by the old gods and the new, to fight for the north as I would for my own home," she said, voice ringing clearly. "For my blood runs with fire, but my heart stands with the living. I have brought my dragons, my armies, all that I am to this cause. Let this crown be the sign that we are one people united against the darkness." The hall was silent for a span of heartbeats. Then one of the older northern lords stepped forward. "We have heard the rumors of the dead marching. I never thought I'd see a Targaryen standing beside a Stark under this roof, but desperate times demand desperate measures." He turned to Jon. "My king, you have my sword. And you, your grace," he dipped his head to Daenerys, "if you truly fight for the living, then you have my gratitude." Voices rose in agreement, some hesitant, others fervent. Daenerys felt a wave of relief and resolve. The road ahead was perilous, but here and now the bond was forged anew. The living would stand or fall together. She glanced at Jon. He gave a small nod, a ghost of a smile on his lips. They had done the impossible, bridged the gap between dragon and wolf, discovered an ancient relic, and won the trust of at least some of the North. The next step would be to stand against the dead. As the hall erupted in hurried plans and preparations for war, Daenerys touched the dagger at her side, remembering how it had slain the White Walkers in that icy cavern. She remembered the swirling script of Valyria, the promise hidden in those cryptic lines. The first battle had been won, but the war loomed. Still, for the first time in a long while, Daenerys felt not just duty but hope guiding her. She sensed that the dawn might break through the endless winter night if only they fought hard enough. And she knew in her heart that if the legends of a promised prince or princess were true, it might not be about a single person but the union of fire and ice itself, a bond that transcended ambition and fear. What had begun with a whispered rumor in the cursed ruins of Valyria had led her here, to Winterfell, forging an alliance that might save the world. The crowd pressed in with questions, logistics, renewed oaths. But Daenerys caught Jon's eyes across the tumult, and she saw the echo of her own determination. Together they would face the storm. Together they would see if the crown's power, if the union of their legacies, could push back the night once more. And somewhere, in the shifting shadows at the edges of the hall, Bran Stark watched with ancient eyes, as though he already knew how their story would end. But the Dragon Queen would not fear the future. She had discovered the secrets of the past, brought them to bear in the present, and now she would shape tomorrow by her own will. The North was with her, the crown was in their possession, and the dead would soon learn the fires of House Targaryen burned brightly still, tempered now by the iron strength of House Stark. Thus, as the winter winds rattled the walls, Daenerys Stormborn stood tall, forging a new chapter in the song of ice and fire, one that began with the faintest whisper in a ruined city and now resounded in the hearts of all who yearned to see the dawn. Daenerys Stormborn stood in the center of Winterfell's great hall, the voices of the northern lords booming around her as they discussed what needed to be done. The cold drafts that leaked through the stone walls carried with them not just the chill of the endless winter but a sense of urgency that resonated beneath every conversation. It was one thing to gather all this resolve of lords pledging men, women forging new alliances, but quite another to turn promises into the kind of steel that could withstand an army of the dead. She observed the black crown resting on a wooden stand that had been placed at the front of the dais, near the seat of the king in the north. Crafted in a time beyond memory, it was a simple circlet of dark metal, yet it seemed to pulse with a quiet intensity that drew eyes again and again. The artifact felt less like a piece of regalia and more like a living relic, older than Winterfell's oldest stones. It absorbed the firelight in the hall as though drinking in the warmth. Even now, Daenerys could feel a subtle hum when she drew too near, a sensation that prickled at the base of her neck. Jon Snow stood beside her. For all the talk of him being king in the north, his bearing remained grounded, as though the weight of the crown, literal or otherwise, had never sat easily on his head. She noticed how his gaze kept drifting toward the black circlet. He had touched it once in the glacier cave, and the memory of that moment would not soon fade from Daenerys's mind. The metal's chill had raced up their arms like some silent current, linking them for a heartbeat in a pulse of strangeness and power. Many lords and ladies milled about the hall, some stamping their boots to chase away the cold, others clustered in fervent discussion. Sansa Stark stood off to one side, conferring quietly with two of the more influential bannermen, while Arya drifted among the crowd like a silent shadow. The new alliances that had formed since Daenerys' arrival were tenuous, complicated by centuries of northern mistrust toward Targaryens. Yet the men and women of the north could not deny that dragons flew overhead, nor could they ignore the ominous reality of the Night King's forces gathering. Even the most vocal critics of House Targaryen could see that an alliance was now a matter of survival. A hush fell across the hall as Bran Stark entered. He had been absent from the earlier part of the gathering, lost in his own world. Wrapped in furs, the Stark boy, if boy he still was, moved with a measured calm that radiated an almost preternatural knowledge. His eyes seemed to look through Daenerys, through Jon, through everyone. Without prompting, the crowd parted to let him pass. He came to rest before the dais, eyes flicking toward the black crown with a mix of solemnity and a distant curiosity. Sansa stepped forward to greet him. "Bran, do you have something to tell us?" "I saw it," Bran said quietly, though his voice carried in the hush. "In the visions. I see an ancient forging, fire and ice hammered into that crown. It was more than a symbol. It was a binding, a vow that would last as long as winter and summer rose in turn." He glanced at Daenerys and Jon. "It was worn not by a single person but by two. A king of the north, a queen who once walked among dragons. Their images were carved into the ice caves near the Frostfangs. They joined their lines with the magic of the children of the forest. It was how the first long night ended." The forging wasn't only a bond between two people but a living oath that these two sides, wolf and dragon, would stand together against the darkness whenever it returned. Murmurs rippled across the crowd. Daenerys felt a strange clenching in her chest. This spoke directly to the old scroll she had found in Valyria, to the images in the cave carvings near Eastwatch. The notion that the pact was not just symbolic but bound by actual magic explained why the White Walkers had guarded the site of the crown so fiercely. If this crown embodied the vow that once defeated them, then retrieving it might truly threaten their plans. Bran turned his gaze to Daenerys. "You have awakened the old power by bringing the crown back among men. But it's fragile in the sense that it requires renewal. The vow must be spoken again, or it remains only a relic of a pact broken by centuries of conflict." Jon exhaled, glancing between Bran and Daenerys. "And what must be done?" Bran's distant eyes settled on him. "Words matter. Blood matters even more. You and Daenerys are not just leaders, you each carry the blood of the ancient lines. You must stand before the old gods, before the heart tree, and speak a vow that renews the forging of fire and ice. It is part of the crown's power, part of the reason it was created." A tangible hush seized the air. Daenerys felt 100 gazes linger on her. This was not how she had imagined forging alliances. A symbolic vow in front of the old gods, reminiscent of wedding vows, perhaps, or some deeper binding. She had sworn to fight for the North with all her strength, but this required a different kind of promise, one that wove her own destiny inexorably into the destiny of House Stark. She drew a measured breath, lifting her chin. "I will do whatever is necessary to unite the living and defeat the White Walkers." Jon nodded gravely. "As will I. If the vow must be spoken before the old gods, then so be it." Sansa and Arya exchanged a glance, and Daenerys sensed that they too were grappling with what this meant. The Targaryen queen kneeling before the old gods, forging a vow with House Stark, none of it was how they might have envisioned the shape of the North's future. But these were extraordinary times. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters. The hall's torches guttered in a sudden draft. Daenerys suppressed a shiver. It was as though the wind itself beckoned them to make haste, for the real threat drew closer by the day. Snow fell with relentless persistence, piling high against Winterfell's walls and blanketing the courtyard in white silence. Jon gestured for the black crown to be returned to its chest for safekeeping. In the commotion, Daenerys retreated to the edges of the hall, giving the lords and ladies space to discuss logistics, food stores, arming peasants, smithing dragoglass weapons. Though she was queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men by her own claim. She recognized that in Winterfell the northern lords took their cues from Jon, from Sansa, from each other. She was still an outsider, Targaryen or not, and she had learned from experience that rule must come through respect, not fear. Her dragons were enough to stoke fear, but she hoped to earn more than that. She studied the interactions, the proud Lord Glover, the cautious Lady Mormont, the quiet but steadfast Serwyn heir. They spoke in grim, practical terms of the threat. More and more, ravens arrived from the outlying areas, reporting glimpses of whites, of strange movements in the forest, of livestock slaughtered. Still, no large force had attacked. The White Walkers seemed to be amassing rather than striking. That might offer the living time to prepare, but it also hinted at the scale of the onslaught to come. A tap on Daenerys's elbow drew her from her observations. She turned to see Missandei, who had journeyed with her from Essos. The young Nathi woman offered a gentle smile, though concern knitted her brow. "Your Grace," Missandei said quietly. "You have arrested since you returned from beyond the wall. The healers say you should let them check your shoulder again." Daenerys gave a faint laugh, nodding. "Yes. I suppose I should. The wound still aches in the cold." They excused themselves from the hall, stepping into one of the drafty corridors. Torchlight flickered on the rough stone. They had not walked far before the large shape of Grey Worm materialized at the end of the corridor. He bowed his head slightly. Though stoic as ever, Daenerys could read the lines of worry etched around his eyes. The Unsullied had stationed themselves throughout Winterfell's perimeter, working with the Northern Watchmen to fortify vulnerable spots. Dragons patrolled above, but the Unsullied's discipline provided a backbone on the ground that reassured her. She trusted them implicitly. Grey Worm spoke in a subdued tone. "My queen, the men stand ready. We will follow you anywhere. There is talk of movement from the east, near the coast. Some of the local scouts fear the dead might attempt to circle around the major roads." Daenerys nodded. "Ensure the lines of communication remain open. We cannot be caught unaware. I want watchers on the coastline as well, especially near Eastwatch. And have the dragons fly frequent patrols. We can't let even small pockets of the dead creep up unchallenged." "As you command." He dipped his head and disappeared back down the hall. Missandei placed a guiding hand on Daenerys's arm. "Come, let us see to your shoulder. Then you can rest before we meet in the Godwood." Daenerys allowed herself to be led to a small chamber that had been converted into an infirmary, where she found a northern healer who was older than her own years combined. Her face seamed with wrinkles. The woman, called Karis, examined the wound with efficient care. Daenerys bit back a wince as Karis prodded at the bruised flesh. "You're lucky that White Walker's spear only grazed you," Karis muttered. "If it had struck deeper, the cold alone might have left a more lasting mark." "I'm grateful," Daenerys said. "I have no desire to fall before I see this war won." Karis nodded, deftly applying a fresh poultice. "We need your dragons, your grace. No sense in letting an old fool like me lecture you about rest, but do try not to overdo it." Daenerys offered a gentle smile. "I'll try." When the healer finished, Daenerys and Missandei returned to a modest solar that had been set aside for the queen's use. The room was small compared to the palatial chambers of Meereen or the lavish manors of Pentos, but the Northerners had done their best to accommodate her. A fire crackled in the hearth, providing a meager warmth against the biting chill. Daenerys sank onto a wooden chair, pressing a hand to her temple. She felt the weight of so many battles and journeys behind her, and yet the greatest struggle still lay ahead. Even dragons grew weary when the night had no end in sight. Missandei sat opposite her. "Shall I bring you something to eat, your grace?" "In a while," Daenerys said. "First, I want your counsel." Missandei nodded attentively. "Always, your grace. Bran said we must stand before the old gods. A vow, a forging of fire and ice. Jon and I," she paused, feeling a subtle tension coil in her. "It sounds almost like a wedding vow, but it need not be, does it?" Missandei pursed her lips. "I am not certain, your grace. But from what little I've learned of Westerosi customs, such vows before the old gods do resemble matrimonial rites. Even so, this may be something older than that tradition, more primal." Daenerys exhaled. "Yes, I sense that as well. But the people might see it as binding in more ways than one. I have no illusions about the politics here. Some might rejoice at a union between me and Jon Snow, others might bristle that a Targaryen sets foot in their sacred godwood. Yet if it solidifies unity against the undead, I must do it." Missandei offered a sympathetic look. "Does the thought trouble you, my queen?" Daenerys stared into the fire, remembering how quickly her life had changed since she first landed on Westeros shores. "I don't know. Jon is a good man. An honorable man. We share a goal. But you and I both know how alliances can be twisted. Still, I think if it helps, then so be it. There are more pressing concerns than the shape of my personal future. We speak here the living against the dead. And, well, perhaps we are forging something genuine in our own way." Missandei smiled gently, eyes warm. "You trust him." "I do," Daenerys admitted. "I have come to trust him, even though trust never came easily to me. We've bled together beyond the wall. We've fought side by side. If any man in Westeros understands what it means to battle impossible odds, it's Jon Snow." A soft knock at the door caused them both to turn. Sansa Stark entered with measured steps. Daenerys rose to greet her, and Missandei, with a quick bow, stepped aside. The Lady of Winterfell inclined her head politely. "Apologies for the interruption," Sansa said. "I wanted to ensure everything is prepared for tonight in the Godwood, so I came to speak with you." Daenerys nodded. "Of course." Sansa's face was composed, though there was a subtle tension around her eyes. "I grew up in the faith of the Seven, but also among those who keep to the old gods. My father, Ned Stark, was devoted to the Godwood, always visiting the Heart Tree. This vow, Bran insists, it is a recreation of an ancient tradition. We will gather there by moonlight, with the crown placed upon the weirwood's roots. Then you and Jon will speak the words that came from that scroll, the ones Bran has deciphered." Daenerys' stomach fluttered. "Words in Valyrian, or?" Sansa shook her head. "They're older than the common tongue or even High Valyrian. More akin to the language of the children of the forest. Bran has a phrase or two he wants you both to recite. He says the meaning is simple: we stand as one, bound in blood, forging flame and frost. A few lines like that in an old dialect." Daenerys exhaled. "I see. That is straightforward enough." Sansa offered a tight smile. "It might sound unnatural in your mouth or Jon's, but if it's necessary, so be it. I want you to know that not all the northern lords will understand this. Some may think it is a wedding rite or some strange foreign magic. The North is steeped in tradition, and you are still new to us." Daenerys nodded. "I appreciate your candor, Lady Sansa. Jon and I will do our best to reassure them that this vow only serves to strengthen our unity against the dead." Sansa hesitated. "I also came to say, I am grateful that you have come this far and that you brought your armies and your dragons here, even though Westeros did not always treat your family with kindness. If my father were alive, I think he'd double you. And the North to stand for what is right. At least, I like to believe so." There was sincerity in her words that touched Daenerys more than she expected. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know we come from lines that have clashed. But I see no reason the future must mirror the past. We have a greater foe now." Sansa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then let us see to it together." She took her leave, her furs swirling behind her, and Daenerys watched her go. In many ways, Sansa reminded her of women she had encountered in the courts of Essos, astute, self-possessed, shaped by hardship. Yet Sansa also carried an undercurrent of fierce loyalty to her family that Daenerys respected. It was an inheritance of the North itself, a testament to how House Stark had survived for so many centuries. Missandei cleared her throat softly. "Shall I help you prepare, Your Grace?" Daenerys nodded. "Yes, let's be about it. I should rest a little too. Tonight might mark a new beginning." Night fell swiftly. The snow, illuminated by a wan moon, glowed eerily in the courtyard. Columns of cold starlight stretched across the battlements, where watchmen stood vigil, scanning the dark horizon for any sign of the dead. Daenerys felt the hush that precedes a solemn ritual as she made her way toward the Godwood. She wore a cloak of white fur lined with subtle silver stitching, northern craftsmanship gifted to her as a gesture of unity. Underneath, she retained her more typical attire, a dark gown cut to allow movement, embroidered with subtle dragon-scale patterns. Jon awaited her at the mouth of the Godwood, flanked by 2 guards who stood aside when she approached. He wore black furs, simple in design, reminiscent of his time in the Night's Watch. In the quiet swirl of snow, Daenerys met his gaze, and something passed between them, an understanding that whatever vow they spoke tonight would affect the entire realm, that they stepped into the territory of myth as much as politics. He broke the silence first. "You look ready." Daenerys glanced at the faint scar on his cheek, the memory of how he earned it in battle overshadowed by the quiet confidence in his eyes. "I am." They passed under the ancient trees, whose branches rustled softly overhead. Moonlight pierced the canopy in shifting patches, illuminating the freshly fallen snow. The heart tree in the center loomed, its pale trunk carved with a solemn face. Red sap stained the grooves like tears of blood. Bran stood by the base of the trunk, his expression as cryptic as ever, while Sansa and Arya waited nearby. A small cluster of northern lords had gathered at a respectful distance, those who dared to witness. A few unsullied guards stood on the periphery, silent as statues. At the heart tree's foot lay a simple block of carved wood upon which the black crown rested. The sight of that metal ring made Daenerys' pulse quicken. Dim torchlight mingled with silver moonbeams, lending the crown an otherworldly gleam. Bran waited until she and Jon stepped forward, then bowed his head to them. "Are you both prepared to speak the vow?" Daenerys inhaled. "Yes." Jon squared his shoulders. "We are." Bran extended his hands toward the crown. Long ago, in the age of heroes, men and the children of the forest stood together against the darkness. The forging of fire and ice was not just a treaty but a living bond made manifest in this crown. You have reclaimed it from the far north, and now you must renew the vow that once sealed the fate of the Night King. Listen carefully to my words. Repeat them as best you can. He spoke a guttural phrase, half-chanted, the syllables strange and lilting as though the mouth struggled to shape them. Daenerys recognized elements reminiscent of the children's cave drawings, an older language still. She swallowed, her breath a pale cloud, and repeated the words carefully. She felt them vibrate in her chest as if carrying a hidden resonance. Jon joined her, stumbling a bit over the unfamiliar syllables but persevering with quiet determination. As they spoke, Daenerys felt a warmth rise from her core, spreading outward. The wind rattling the branches overhead seemed to hush for a moment. The black crown on its wooden block appeared to shimmer as though responding to the vow. She and Jon concluded the chant with the final phrase, something akin to bound in blood, forging flame and frost. Silence fell. Bran's eyes fluttered and Daenerys saw that distant, far-seeing look on his face. Then he inclined his head. Place your hands upon the crown, each of you. Daenerys stepped forward. Jon did likewise. Together, they lowered their hands until they touched the cold metal. At once she felt a shock, an electric surge that raced through her veins. Jon let out a small gasp and she knew he felt it too. It wasn't painful, but it was impossibly vivid, like a spark of living magic awakening in the winter air. The crown warmed beneath their fingers, its metal dark yet charged with energy. A soft glow pulsed along its edges, faint as moonlight on steel but unmistakable. Daenerys's heart hammered. For a breath she swore she could hear distant whispers, voices layered upon voices in a swirl of ancient echoes. She resisted the urge to pull away. The intensity receded, leaving behind a heightened awareness. She felt Jon's presence as if it were woven into her own senses, a thread that vibrated in harmony with her heartbeat. Dimly, she realized the watchers in the godwood were staring, some in awe, some in fear. Bran spoke softly. It is done. The vow is renewed. The forging stands again. Daenerys exhaled slowly, lifting her hand from the crown. Jon did the same, jaw tight. She looked at him, and in the flickering shadows she saw that same wide-eyed astonishment she herself must be wearing. Something had happened, something bigger than either of them. The vow had not merely been words. A gust of wind stirred the branches overhead and the godwood seemed to breathe out a long sigh. For a moment, the hush broke and the watchers murmured. Sansa exchanged a glance with Arya while Tormund Giantsbane, who had quietly joined the assembly, scratched his beard, a look of open wonder on his face. The black crown now lay still, its surface no longer glowing. But Daenerys sensed that the magic lingered within. She felt it in her blood, the same blood that had once birthed dragons in the flames. Jon turned to face the gathered lords and ladies, speaking in a voice that carried through the crisp air. Let all bear witness. We have renewed the vow that once saved humanity from the long night. The crown of fire and ice stands not for one house but for the realm entire. Let us stand as one, as the forging intended. A moment of quiet and then a half-dozen voices rose in agreement. Lords Glover, Serwyn, and others pledged anew to the cause. Daenerys saw the flicker of hope in their faces. She prayed that this would indeed bolster morale, that the vow would mean something tangible in the days to come. But overshadowing that hope was the knowledge of the peril creeping ever closer. Jon gingerly picked up the crown and turned to Daenerys. He raised the circlet as though to place it on her head. Her stomach flipped. Would this be seen as her crowning in the north? The onlookers might not be ready for such a display. Yet there was an inexorable logic to it. The vow had been spoken, forging them together for this fight. Before he could complete the gesture, Bran's voice interrupted. Wait. Jon glanced at his brother. What is it? Bran's gaze flicked from Jon to Daenerys, then back. The vow was meant to unite two lines, two powers. In the age of heroes, the crown was worn by both. It's not an ordinary crown to be claimed by a single ruler. You two must share it. Daenerys looked at Jon uncertainly. How did one share a crown? Yet the meaning felt symbolic. They would reign side by side, not in the sense of husband and wife necessarily, but as two powers bound by this vow. She sensed the weight of the watcher's stares and forced herself not to falter. Softly, Jon nodded. Then so be it. He lifted the circlet, settling it lightly on Daenerys's head. A hush fell. Daenerys suppressed a tremor, feeling the cold metal against her brow, the faint echo of that earlier magic. Then Jon removed it and placed it on his own head for a single moment. Again, the hush. Then he took it off, setting it back on the wooden block at the heart tree's roots, as though to say that the crown was not about personal glory. It was a relic of unity. Later, as the watchers dispersed, Daenerys lingered in the godswood, gazing at the heart tree's solemn face. Snow gathered on its exposed roots. The hush of the night was absolute. Dimly, she heard the distant wings of her dragons overhead, scanning for threats even now. John approached her quietly. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she felt a swirl of emotions she could scarcely name. "I feel different." She paused, letting out a shaky breath. "As if something in me has settled or awakened." John exhaled, his breath a cloud in the frigid air. "I feel it too. Like the vow bridged some gap I never knew existed." She looked at him. "This vow brand said it would renew an ancient forging. Do you think it makes us unstoppable?" He shook his head, a wry smile ghosting his lips. "I doubt it. The White Walkers are still out there, and we are only flesh and blood. But maybe we have a fighting chance now, more than we did before." She let that hope sit between them. Then she noticed the cut on John's cheek from an earlier skirmish with a white. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. He touched his cheek, wincing a little. "Only a scratch. Like yours." For a moment they simply regarded each other under the old god's silent witness. Then, with mutual understanding, they turned and left the godwood, returning to the keep. The vow had been sealed, the forging was done. In the days that followed, news of the vow spread among the northern lords and beyond. Daenerys heard quiet talk among the Winterfell corridors, some calling it a marriage in all but name, others hailing it as a sign that the Targaryen queen was part of the North now. Still others whispered that the vow was black magic. She tried not to let rumor consume her. There was far too much practical work to be done. She convened daily councils with Jon, Sansa, the assembled lords, and her own advisors. Dragonglass weapons were being forged in the depths of Winterfell's smithy, and lines of supply were arranged from White Harbor and the more hospitable areas of the north. Throughout it all, a gnawing sense of expectation weighed on them. The White Walkers had not yet launched their main offensive, but pockets of whites were sighted more frequently. The occasional skirmishes tested the edges of their defenses. Always, the stories that arrived by Raven carried a sense of dread. Entire villages had vanished. Hunters found footprints and no bodies. The dead were gathering. One day, as Daenerys paced the courtyard supervising as a new shipment of dragonglass arrived, she caught sight of an unfamiliar party riding through the gates. Horsemen in dark cloaks, accompanied by a tall figure whose posture hinted at aristocratic bearing. She recognized House Manderly's sigil on one of the men, but the rest wore the chain of the Citadel, Maesters. Her pulse quickened. The Citadel had sent an envoy? She hurried toward them with Ser Darius and Missandei at her side, curiosity burning in her gut. The tall man dismounted, pulling back his hood to reveal an older face with deep-set eyes and wisps of gray hair. A single link of Valyrian steel glinted among the metals of his maester's chain. "Your Grace," he said, bowing stiffly. "I am Maester Aemon's successor at the Citadel, called Maester Karen. We have been sent north to confirm the rumors of the undead." Daenerys arched a brow. "Confirm? You ride all this way in the dead of winter just to confirm the truth of the White Walkers?" He shifted his feet. "There are those in Old Town who remain skeptical despite many reports. My superiors charged me with verifying the veracity of these claims and offering whatever counsel our library might provide. I was also instructed to learn more about the artifact discovered in Valyria." His gaze flicked to Daenerys, filled with a subdued curiosity. "The Black Crown." Daenerys exchanged a glance with Missandei. This was unexpected. The Maesters had generally been cautious, sometimes dismissive of magic. But if they had come all this way, perhaps even the Citadel could not ignore the mounting evidence. She inclined her head. "Come inside. The king in the north and I will meet with you. We will share what we know, and perhaps you can help us unravel the last of this mystery." They made their way to the great hall, where fires blazed in the hearths. Snow clung to the travelers' boots, melting into puddles on the stone floor. Jon arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by a messenger. He greeted Maester Karen courteously but with reserved skepticism, given how the Citadel had sometimes resisted the notion of White Walkers. The Maester explained that word of Daenerys's expedition to Valyria and her discovery of an ancient scroll referencing the Stark lineage had spread. The Citadel had attempted to piece together the fragments of pre-Doom Valyrian texts in their libraries, but many references were incomplete or contradictory. The Black Crown, they believed, was the missing link, an object rumored in the oldest annals to have been crafted in the forging of Westeros' earliest alliances. Jon listened patiently, then gestured for the Black Crown to be brought forth. Ser Darius retrieved it from a locked chest in a side chamber, presenting it to Maester Karen. At once, the old man's eyes lit with fascination, his fingers hovering over the dark metal. "Incredible," Karen breathed. "You can see the faint inscriptions along the inside band. Yes, these shapes are reminiscent of the runes used by the children of the forest, and here, yes, you can see the swirl of stylized dragons. A melding of cultures indeed." He glanced at Daenerys. Have you worn it since the forging vow? Daenerys nodded. We did, briefly, in the Godwood. The vow was spoken and we both felt a surge of power as though the crown awakened. Karen's eyes gleamed. Then the stories were true. This object is more than mere metal. Tell me, do you believe it can be used in battle? Does it hold a direct power against the White Walkers? Jon rubbed his jaw. We don't know. Bran Stark, my brother, suggests it's primarily symbolic, a binding that unifies our lines. But who can say how that might manifest in the face of the enemy? The Maester hummed thoughtfully. I will consult my references. There may yet be passages in the Citadel's restricted library that can shed light on this. What if the forging vow or the artifact itself can weaken the Night King's hold on the undead? There are legends that speak of a thrice-bound crown forging a barrier against Winter's wrath. The oldest sources are fragmentary, but perhaps they refer to this. He eyed the circlet as though it were a puzzle box he longed to crack open. Daenerys felt a flicker of hope. If you can discover anything that might help us, we'll be grateful. He nodded. I will do what I can. But in return, I must see this threat for myself, the White Walkers, the Whites. The Citadel cannot act on rumor alone. We prefer knowledge to speculation. Jon's mouth twisted in a thin smile. You'll have your proof soon enough, I fear. The dead won't remain at the fringes forever. They offered the Maester and his companions rooms in Winterfell, though the keep was already crowded. The presence of Citadel scholars in the midst of a war council felt surreal to Daenerys, but she reminded herself that knowledge could be a weapon. If they gleaned any advantage from these texts, it could be the difference between survival and annihilation. By the next morning, winter storms howled more fiercely. Patrols reported White attacks near Deepwood Motte and along the King's Road south of Winterfell. The greatest threat still lay to the north, somewhere beyond the Land's End, presumably close to the shattered remains of the wall where the Night King had first unleashed his onslaught. But smaller groups, swift and silent, harried the outskirts of the north, testing defenses and sapping the morale of outlying villages. Daenerys spent much of each day conferring with her generals, sorting out deployment for her Unsullied, her Dothraki, and the northern levies. The Dothraki had adapted poorly to the cold at first, horses dying in the harsh conditions, warriors unaccustomed to wearing thick furs. Yet their fierce spirit remained unbroken. Their new Khalasar leaders recognized that this war was unlike any they had fought, and honorable death in battle was preferable to becoming part of an army of the dead. When not in council, Daenerys checked on her dragons. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion had grown restless, pacing the skies above Winterfell. The frigid air was no obstacle to them, though Daenerys worried about the possibility of the Night King wielding his ice spears with deadly aim. The memory of how easily a White Walker had almost wounded Drogon haunted her. She had to balance her dragon's unstoppable power with the risk of losing them. Each flight was a gamble. Still, they were the realm's best hope of matching the Night King's supernatural strength. One evening, as the sky darkened to a stormy gray and the air crackled with frost, Daenerys took Drogon on a scouting patrol over the northern plains. Snow lashed her face, stinging her eyes even through protective goggles. From the altitude, she saw little but an endless expanse of white, broken by the occasional cluster of barren trees or rocky outcroppings. She pressed Drogon onward, mindful not to linger so far from Winterfell that they couldn't return swiftly. She was about to turn back when she glimpsed movement below, a ragged column of whites, perhaps a score or more. They marched with implacable steadiness, heading south, trailing a lifeless hush in their wake. On the edges, pale figures with glowing blue eyes strode on dead horses, White Walkers, or perhaps White Outriders. Daenerys' stomach clenched. This was a larger group than the small pockets encountered before. She spurred Drogon to dive. Flame roared from his maw, an arc of blazing wrath that devoured the back ranks of the undead. Whites crumpled, shrieking soundlessly before they melted into ashen remains. Some tried to scatter, but the snow offered them no cover from aerial fire. Daenerys circled, letting Drogon unleash another torrent. The Pale Outriders raised their weapons in a futile attempt to strike back, but they had no ranged projectiles that could reach a dragon at full altitude. Within moments, the column was incinerated, the last White's shriek carried away on the winter wind. Daenerys surveyed the blackened swath where the flames had consumed them, feeling both triumph and dread. For every group she destroyed, how many more existed out there in the emptiness? The White Walkers might be deliberately sacrificing these small bands to lure out her dragons, to test her tactics. She had to be cautious. She turned Drogon southward, returning to Winterfell as the first stars pricked through the iron-gray sky. Night settled quickly, the storms relentless. By the time she landed within Winterfell's courtyard, her muscles ached from the cold and her skin burned from the wind's assault. Jon met her at the gates, concern etched in his features. "Any trouble?" he asked. She recounted the skirmish. He frowned. "Their incursions grow bolder. But at least we know your dragons can still destroy them with ease if the White Walkers don't intervene directly." Daenerys nodded, sliding from Drogon's side and patting his massive flank. She felt the exhausted tension in his body. "We have to be ready for the real army." This was but a fraction. Jon agreed. They walked side by side through the courtyard, discussing preparations for a larger attack. Fires glowed in braziers, illuminating the swirling snow. Daenerys couldn't help but notice how many men and women were gathered at Winterfell, a multitude from various northern houses, from the Vale, even from the Riverlands where lords had pledged arms. If the rumored threat were not so dire, it might have resembled the gathering of an allied host for a typical war, but this was anything but typical. Tyrion Lannister, who had once been Daenerys's hand, would have marveled at the scope of such an alliance, but he was not here. The separation from her once trusted advisor still weighed on her, but the lines of war had become muddled since she'd left the south. If Tyrion lived, he was likely in King's Landing or exiled somewhere else. The last she'd heard, Cersei Lannister refused to acknowledge the White Walker threat. Daenerys knew that if the undead advanced this far south, even Cersei would have to confront reality. But she had no illusions about receiving help from the Lannisters. For now, the north was her stronghold, and these were her allies. Over the next few days, the Citadel's Maester Caron immersed himself in old tomes, cross-referencing them with notes from Bran's visions and the archaic texts Daenerys had brought from Valyria. Occasionally, he would emerge to spout theories. The crown might amplify the effect of dragon flame upon the White Walkers, or it might allow the forging vow to alter the course of winter's magic. His suggestions were tantalizing but unproven. He needed to see the crown in action, he said, to study its resonance in the presence of the undead. Daenerys was wary of leading him into direct battle, but the time might come when battle found them regardless. That time arrived sooner than expected. Reports came of a massive formation of whites marching across the shivering sea's frozen coastline. They were heading toward Last Hearth, the seat of House Umber, long considered the first major castle in the path of the others if they came south. The Umbers had already evacuated most of their small folk to Winterfell, but a token garrison remained to watch for signs of the undead. Now it seemed the time for watchers was over. Jon convened a war council, gathering every high-ranking officer and lord in the Great Hall. Sansa sat near the dais, representing the Stark's leadership, while Daenerys stood at Jon's side, her dragons in distant flight above the keep. Maester Caron and Bran were also present. A hush settled as Tormund stepped forward, shaking melting snow off his cloak. "They're heading for Last Hearth in large numbers, maybe thousands. It's too big a host for a quick raid. We'd need an army of our own to slow them down." Jon's expression was grim. "If we don't confront them at Last Hearth, they'll push closer to Winterfell, and we'll be facing them on our doorstep with less room to maneuver." A northern lord, tall and bearded, spoke up. "The castle is strong, but not enough to withstand thousands of whites. If we attempt to hold it, we risk losing men who might be better positioned behind stronger walls." Another, older lord shook his head. "Abandoning Last Hearth means giving the dead a foothold. That place is the old seat of the Umbers. It'll become an undead stronghold if it falls. They'll only grow stronger." Sansa glanced between them. "We can't afford to spread ourselves too thin. If we take too few men, we'll be overrun. If we commit too many, we weaken Winterfell's defenses." Daenerys cleared her throat. "What if we strike from the air before they reach the castle? My dragons can incinerate large swathes of the whites. Our ground forces could then move in to finish off any stragglers. The main question is whether the Night King is with his host." Bran's vacant gaze drifted across the table. "I sense he is not. But that does not mean there aren't White Walkers among them." Maester Caron lifted a trembling hand. "If you do plan a confrontation, may I accompany you? I must observe the crown's reaction in the presence of the undead. It might prove a critical piece of knowledge." Jon exchanged a wary glance with Daenerys. She understood the man's eagerness for knowledge but was loath to expose him and the crown to direct danger. Yet the logic was not without merit. If the crown contained any hidden power that could shift the tide, better to discover it sooner than later. After some debate, the council decided they would muster a sizable force, part of the northern levies, supplemented by unsullied Dothraki outriders. Daenerys would lead from the air on Drogon, with Rhaegal and Viserion flying in tandem if the weather permitted. Jon would ride with the ground forces. Maester Caron could join under heavy guard to observe the crown in the field. They would march at first light, hoping to intercept the undead army before it reached Last Hearth. If the horde was too large, they would retreat in phases, drawing the whites into dragonfire ambushes. When the council adjourned, the chill of impending battle lingered. Daenerys felt a tightness in her chest. This was it, the first real confrontation with a substantial force of the dead. If they succeeded, they could cripple one of the Night King's major thrusts into the north. If they failed, the road to Winterfell would be wide open. The dawn broke cold and pale. Snow fell in thick drifts as the assembled troops formed ranks in Winterfell's courtyard, ready to depart. Daenerys strode through the lines, exchanging words of encouragement with her unsullied captains. She passed the Dothraki, who chanted war cries that sounded eerie in the silent winter air. Northern banners flapped overhead, house sigils that evoked the memory of ancient battles, none quite like this one. Jon rode at the forefront on a sturdy northern horse, wearing the black fur cloak that had become his signature. He offered Daenerys a small, resolute nod as she approached on foot. Nearby, Missandei held the chest that contained the black crown, guarded by two Unsullied. Atop the chest, the swirling steel dagger Daenerys had carried since Valyria glimmered with faint iridescence, as though it too remembered the White Walker it had helped slay. Maester Karen was perched nervously on a horse, layered in warm cloaks far too large for his frame. His face was pinched, but excitement glowed in his eyes. Sansa stood on the steps of the keep, her expression torn. She would remain behind to oversee Winterfell's defense, a role of paramount importance. Arya was already with the vanguard, insisting on riding out to scout ahead with a small team. Brienne and Podrick joined her, along with a handful of the Vale's best archers. Daenerys looked skyward. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion circled above, black silhouettes against the winter clouds. Their roars echoed faintly. Daenerys allowed herself one steadying breath, then climbed a makeshift platform of crates to mount Drogon once he landed. The dragon's body radiated warmth, a living furnace in the midst of the icy dawn. With a final exchange of nods, the host began to move. Jon led the main column through Winterfell's gates, the horses' hooves crunching on packed snow. The Unsullied marched in disciplined formation, their spears tipped with dragonglass. Dothraki outriders fanned out on either flank, scanning the horizon. Daenerys and her dragons swept overhead, a vanguard of flame and terror for any undead who might challenge them. The journey northward was arduous but relatively swift, given that the roads had been cleared as best as possible. Still, the incessant snowfall slowed progress. Each time they paused, scouts brought fresh reports of white sightings. The knowledge that an army of thousands awaited them lent a grim edge to every breath. Late on the second day, they closed in on the outskirts of Last Hearth's domain. The land here was rugged, dotted with hills and scattered forests. The occasional ruin or half-buried farmstead broke the monotony of white. As dusk approached, Daenerys soared high on Drogon, scanning for any sign of the undead host. Visibility was poor, the clouds spit flurries of snow that drifted in swirling gusts. Finally, she spotted movement to the northeast, a dark mass churning across a field like an army of ants. Her stomach lurched. Even from this distance, she could see the ragged lines, the uncanny gait of whites. They stretched far enough to fill half her field of vision. It was larger than she'd expected, surely more than a few thousand. At their center stood pale riders, likely White Walkers, spaced among the throng. Daenerys urged Drogon downward, signaling to Rhaegal and Viserion with a shrill whistle. Together, the three dragons descended on the main body of the living army, who had halted upon spotting Daenerys's signals. She landed near Jon, who rode forward anxiously. "How many?" he asked. "Too many," she replied, her voice tight. "We have to hit them hard. We can't let them reach Last Hearth. If they entrench, it's over." Jon relayed orders to the column. The ground force would angle to the west, using a ridgeline for cover, while Daenerys and the dragons circled around to unleash a surprise flank attack of dragonfire. Once the whites turned, the main host would slam into them from behind, hopefully catching them in a pincer. They split quickly, the snow-muffled ground swallowing the thunder of hooves and marching feet. Daenerys rose once more into the sky, adrenaline surging. She glanced back at the chest strap to one of the supply wagons where the Black Crown was kept. Maester Karen insisted on riding close to the front lines. So be it. They'd have to keep him safe and see if he observed anything about the crown's power. As she circled wide, the wind cut like knives across her face. Drogon's enormous wings beat with steady, relentless force. Below, she glimpsed the horde of whites pouring around a rocky outcropping, their forward momentum unstoppable. They did not tire, did not need rest or warmth. They simply marched, a silent wave of death. Daenerys waited until she was nearly at their flank, then urged Drogon into a steep dive. Her dragon roared, flame jetting from his maw, a searing torrent that struck the edge of the white formation. Hundreds of undead shriveled in an instant, blackened bones collapsing. Regal and Valyrian followed suit from the other side, hammering the horde with jets of fire. Screeches and hissing filled the air as the stench of burning flesh rose. The White Walkers reacted with eerie swiftness. She saw them gesturing with their ice-forged weapons, directing whites to scatter. Some began hurling spears of ice upward, though the dragons were high enough to avoid direct hits, at least for now. Daenerys circled around for another pass. This time, Drogon's fire carved a swath right through the middle of the undead ranks. Dozens more fell. Then, from below, a White Walker raised a massive spear. Daenerys's heart seized. She yanked on Drogon's harness, banking hard. The spear left the White Walker's hand with unnatural speed, slicing the air in a deadly arc. Drogon evaded, the ice spear whistling past them, so close that Daenerys felt its chilling wind. It crashed harmlessly to the ground. She let out a shaky breath, heart-pounding. Trumpets blared from the west. Jon's cavalry emerged over the ridge, galloping down into the flank of the Whites. The earth shook with the rumble of hooves, and the clash of steel on bone echoed. Unsullied infantry formed a disciplined line behind the cavalry, pressing the attack. Dothraki riders hooped and charged from the eastern flank, sabers slicing through whites in a blinding flurry. For a moment, the combined onslaught seemed unstoppable. The whites were hammered from three sides, with dragons unleashing fire from above. But the horde was massive, and the White Walkers rallied their forces with silent command. Clusters of whites clawed at horses, pulling riders down. Screams of the living mingled with the horrifying shrieks of the dead. Bodies fell, only to rise again moments later as whites turned against their former allies. Daenerys tried to keep a strategic overview, strafing the densest pockets of undead with dragonfire. She glimpsed a cluster of White Walkers assembling near the center, their weapons raised. Could they be conjuring a blizzard or some other magic? A swirl of icy wind rippled out from them, snuffing out some of the flames on the battlefield. Daenerys grit her teeth, urging Drogon to dive again. Far below, she spotted the wagon that carried the Black Crown. It was flanked by unsullied guards, with Maester Karen visible, anxiously scribbling on a parchment even as chaos raged. Whites surged toward that position, their skeletal arms outstretched. Grey Worm's voice bellowed above the din, rallying the guards to form a defensive perimeter. Daenerys dove, unleashing a column of flame to incinerate the whites threatening the wagon. In the glow of Drogon's fire, she saw Maester Karen staring at the chest, eyes wide. The metal band of his maester's chain glinted like ice. She had no time to wonder what new discovery he might be making. Another White Walker's spear soared upward, forcing her to veer sharply, losing sight of the wagon. At ground level, Jon was in the thick of combat, his sword long-clawed decapitating whites with every swing. His horse had been slain beneath him, so he fought on foot, calling to the northern bannermen to hold the line. On the eastern flank, Tormund's voice roared as he led wildlings in a berserker charge. Fire arrows rained down from archers perched on the ridge, targeting the White Walkers who directed the horde. Though the undead outnumbered the living, the dragon's constant fire overhead began to tilt the balance. Hundreds, then thousands of whites were reduced to ash. The White Walkers realized they were exposed, that the living fought with more discipline and strategy than in the past. Daenerys watched from the skies as the pale figures seemed to confer silently. Then, in near unison, they began to retreat northward, sacrificing whites to cover their withdrawal. Jon, panting and bloodied, raised his sword, rallying the troops forward. But caution prevailed, for chasing White Walkers too far might lead them into a trap. The living pressed enough to drive the undead back another half-mile, incinerating swarms of whites, until the field was littered with blackened corpses that would rise no more. Then the horns sounded to call a halt, the wearied men and women forming a ragged line where the snow was stained red and black with blood and ash. Daenerys landed amidst the swirling snow, dismounting Drogon to check on the wounded. Her boots crunched over charred remains. The stench choked her. She spotted Jon leaning on his sword, trying to catch his breath. "Are you hurt?" she asked, pressing a hand to his shoulder. He shook his head, though sweat and grime streaked his face. "Not badly. But we lost many." She swallowed hard, surveying the carnage. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of the living lay dead. A fraction compared to the whites annihilated, but each loss weighed heavily. This was not the final battle, merely a prelude to the onslaught that waited. If the Night King himself had been here, the outcome might have been vastly different. Maester Karen appeared, escorted by Grey Worm and the Unsullied. His cloak was scorched in places, and he stank of smoke. Clutched in his arms was the black crown, the chest nowhere in sight. His eyes glowed with a feverish excitement that contrasted with the horror around them. "Your Grace," he called, stumbling forward toward Daenerys and Jon. "I have observed the crown's reaction. It resonates with the presence of the White Walkers. Did you feel anything?" Jon wiped sweat from his brow. "We were a bit preoccupied." Karen shook his head as though disappointed. "I recorded a surge of energy when the White Walkers approached, a faint hum that caused the chest's iron fittings to vibrate. This crown is no inert relic. It responds to them." Daenerys frowned. "What does that mean exactly?" "If I had to guess," the Maester said, "it means the vow hammered into this crown is recognized by the magic animating the Walkers and their whites. They loathe it, fear it even. Perhaps it was part of what turned the tide." Jon looked skeptical. "More likely, our dragons and our men turned the tide." "Certainly," Karen admitted. "Yet there was something else. A wave of power. I cannot yet explain. It might be that if the crown were brought closer to the White Walkers under the right conditions, it could disrupt them further. But more study is needed." Daenerys exchanged a glance with Jon. "Then we'll see if your studies yield anything concrete. For now, keep the crown safe." Grey Worm cleared his throat. "We should withdraw to a more defensible position. Nightfall will come soon, and we cannot remain on this field." Reluctantly, Daenerys agreed. They had driven off the undead force for now, but another might follow. Better to move to Last Hearth, fortify the castle with the men and supplies they had, and wait for reinforcements from Winterfell if needed. The living were exhausted, battered by cold and terror. Thus, the battered host limped northward, careful to keep scouts in all directions. They reached Last Hearth by nightfall, finding it half buried in snow and nearly deserted. The few Umbers left behind greeted them with relief and hurried to open the gates. Within the walls of the keep, Daenerys helped organize triage for the wounded, summoning healers and distributing what meager supplies they had brought. The main hall of Last Hearth became a makeshift infirmary. Fires roared in the grates, flickering over the faces of men and women too weary to speak. Jon joined Daenerys as she knelt by a wounded, unsullied soldier, pressing a strip of cloth to a gaping wound in his side. Missandei hovered nearby, her face drawn with worry. The soldier's eyes fluttered. Daenerys recognized him, Kelias, a veteran of her campaigns in Essos. She had seen him train new recruits with unwavering discipline. He managed a faint smile through the pain. "My queen, we drove them back." "We did," Daenerys whispered, throat tight. "Rest now, soldier. We'll get you to the healers." Missandei gently helped him up, guiding him to a quieter corner where a northern healer waited. Daenerys rose, wiping blood from her hands. She looked at Jon. They shared a moment of silence, absorbing the cost of this victory. Jon spoke softly. "Our men fought bravely. But we can't keep up these losses. The real threat is still out there, bigger than this host." Daenerys nodded, feeling the weight of leadership press on her. "We'll do what we can. The vow we renewed, the crown, it must help us find a final solution. Because I don't know how many more battles like this we can survive." She recalled the sense of power she'd felt during the forging vow, the surge that had bound her and Jon's destinies. If there was a way to harness that power, if the crown's vow could cripple the Night King himself, she had to find it. Another memory flickered, the prophecy she'd once heard in the House of the Undying, riddled with images of snow and iron thrones, of darkness and delight. She had not understood it fully then, but now it felt as though every path led to this. The final conflict that would decide the fate of the living. Night settled over Last Hearth, blanketing the keep in a stillness broken only by the moans of the injured and the soft crackle of fires. Daenerys tried to rest for an hour, but sleep eluded her. She paced the ramparts, the icy wind tugging at her hair. Far off in the darkness, the whites lurked, perhaps regrouping for another assault. Drogon and the other dragons perched on the outer walls, their silhouettes stark against the moonlit sky. She felt a presence behind her and turned to see Jon stepping up, his cloak whipping in the breeze. He joined her at the battlement, where they could look out over the desolate plains. The bare trees swayed, and distant shapes might have been whites or simply illusions born of exhaustion. "Could have used another 1,000 men," Jon murmured. "Or a few thousand. Our scouts say the main host of the undead is still out there, even larger. This was only a portion. Daenerys nodded. We're doing all we can to gather more allies. But time is short. He leaned on the cold stone, his breath misting. Bran once said the forging vow might be the key to ending the Night King. That the bond forged between Targaryen and Stark has some ancient meaning that goes beyond heritage. We've renewed that vow now. But how do we use it? She hesitated, the wind biting her cheeks. If the crown truly resonates with the White Walkers, maybe we can lure the Night King himself into a confrontation. A final one. Jon frowned. Risky. He wields powers we barely understand. But you're right. If we want to end this war, we have to face him, not just his whites. Otherwise, he'll keep raising the dead no matter how many we burn. They stood in silence, the enormity of the task looming. Then Jon turned slightly, letting his eyes sweep over the battered courtyard below. I'm sorry you've had to endure so many battles since arriving in Westeros, he said quietly. I know you wanted to claim the Iron Throne to restore your house. Instead, you find yourself locked in endless winter, fighting a war that seems impossible. Daenerys shook her head. I came here to break the wheel, to liberate people from tyranny. It doesn't matter if that tyranny comes from a Lannister or from the Night King. The threat is the same, innocent lives destroyed. I would rather fight here and now than let the dead roll over the Seven Kingdoms. He studied her, a softness in his gaze that made her heart clench. A part of me wishes none of this was real, that we could have faced normal foes, negotiated alliances, and ended the cycle of war. But that's not the path fate laid before us. We have no choice but to stand against death itself. She touched his hand briefly, feeling the warmth of his skin despite the cold air. We'll stand together, she murmured. Fire and ice, the forging vow. If there's a way to end this, we'll find it. The hush of the night pressed around them, the vastness of the frozen land echoing their resolve. For once, Daenerys allowed herself to lean on his presence, taking comfort in the bond they shared, whether forged by prophecy or by choice. In the shadows of the ramparts, two battered leaders found solace in each other's steadiness, aware that the worst was yet to come. Within the next day, ravens flew between Last Hearth and Winterfell, bearing news of the partial victory and the heavy losses. Reinforcements were promised, but the roads were treacherous and time would be needed to muster more men and supplies. Sansa Stark's letters hinted at unrest in the south, with rumors that Cersei Lannister might finally be forced to acknowledge the undead threat. Yet no direct alliance offer had arrived, and Daenerys doubted the sincerity of any Lannister promise. In the battered keep of Last Hearth, Daenerys and Jon oversaw fortifications. The castle's walls were thick, though not as imposing as Winterfell's. Dothraki scouts ranged beyond the perimeter to harry any stray whites. The dragons roamed overhead, a constant deterrent. The wounded were tended with meager resources, and the dead were burned swiftly to prevent reanimation. It was a grim routine, the smell of burning flesh lingering in the air day after day. Late one afternoon, Maester Karen approached Daenerys in the great hall of Last Hearth, where she was conferring with Grey Worm. A tattered old tome was clutched in the maester's hand, his eyes alight with the fervor of discovery. Your Grace, he said, bowing. I believe I've found an important clue in these references, cross-checking them with what I observed on the battlefield. Daenerys dismissed Grey Worm, turning to the maester. Go on. Karen flipped open the tome, revealing cramped text in High Valyrian, interspersed with strange glyphs. He traced a passage with a bony finger. This text speaks of a thrice-forged circle used to banish the dark powers during the long night. According to the translator's notes, this circle was formed by 3 items: the crown of fire and ice, a dagger of waking steel, and a staff of heartwood. It suggests that when these 3 relics are brought together under the vow, they can seal away the magic of the White Walkers. Daenerys stared at him. We have the crown, and I possess a dagger from Valyria. But is that dagger the same one mentioned here? The maester tapped the text again. The so-called dagger of waking steel is described as bearing swirling patterns in the blade, reminiscent of dragon flame forging. You mentioned you found a dagger in that same chest as the scroll, one you used against a White Walker, yes? She nodded slowly, feeling a tingle of memory. The swirling steel, the unearthly glow when it struck the undead. It could be the same. That means we have 2 of the relics. The crown and the dagger. So what of the staff of heartwood? Karen's brow furrowed. It's said to be carved from the weirwood by the children of the forest themselves. imbued with protective runes. If it survives, it would likely be hidden in the deepest parts of the old forests, or guarded by remnants of the children, if any remain. A wave of realization washed over Daenerys. Bran Stark was rumored to have some connection with the children, having traveled beyond the wall. He might know more, and that alone was enough reason to consider the possibility that the staff existed. She remembered the stories of how Bran had become the three-eyed raven, seeing past, present, and future. If anyone could find this staff of Heartwood, it might be him. She let out a measured breath. Then we must return to Winterfell, consult with Bran, and see if we can locate this staff. If the texts are correct, these three relics together might give us the means to end the Night King's power. Karen nodded enthusiastically. I believe so, Your Grace. The forging vow you renewed with Jon Snow would be incomplete without all three aspects of the thrice-forged circle. Daenerys felt a surge of urgency. Another relic quest. But this time, she had little choice if it offered a path to victory beyond endless battles. We'll make arrangements to return to Winterfell as soon as we can secure this castle. Jon will likely agree. She paused, studying the maester's face. If we do find this staff, how exactly do we use it? Just combine it with the dagger and crown. Karen shrugged helplessly. The text is vague. It mentions a ritual, performed under the open sky, where the vow is spoken again, and the staff, crown, and dagger form a circle that closes the door of darkness. I suspect we may need Bran's visions to clarify the details. Daenerys nodded. Then that's our next step. She wasted no time. That evening, she spoke with Jon about the discovery. He listened intently, his expression guarded but hopeful. A staff carved from weirwood, he mused. The children of the forest might have protected it for thousands of years. If it exists, we'll have to rely on Bran. Daenerys folded her arms. We can't stay here indefinitely. We've pushed back the undead for now, but if a larger force comes, Last Hearth isn't secure enough to hold out. Best we gather our men and withdraw to Winterfell while we have the chance. Jon agreed. By dawn, they began organizing the retreat, burning the dead and fortifying the castle as best they could. A small garrison would remain behind, though the majority would march back to Winterfell. Missandei oversaw the packing of the Black Crown and the swirling steel dagger, ensuring they remained guarded at all times. The march south took several days, each step weighed down by the knowledge that the war was far from over. When they at last approached Winterfell's familiar walls, Daenerys felt an odd mix of relief and foreboding. She knew they were returning for answers, but the time they spent searching might allow the Night King's forces to regroup. Still, if the staff was the key to ending this war, it was a risk they had to take. Upon arrival, they were met with anxious faces. Sansa, Arya, and Bran greeted them in the courtyard, scanning the weary ranks for casualties. Daenerys wasted no time. She and Jon, along with Maester Karen and Missandei, convened with Bran in his solar. The boy, if boy he still was, sat by the hearth, hands folded in his lap, eyes distant as always. They explained the reference to the Staff of Heartwood and the potential for forging a final blow against the Night King. Bran listened without blinking, then spoke in a calm, measured tone. I have seen glimpses of such a staff, he said, in the memories of the Weirwoods. A slender branch carved with runes left in a hidden grove beneath the Hill of Faces north of the neck. Legend says the children of the forest used that place to conduct their oldest rites. Jon exchanged a glance with Daenerys. That's not too far. We can travel there by land easily enough. Bran's gaze sharpened. The illusions that guard the grove are strong, and whites roam the swamps near the neck if they stray too far south. But if you truly seek the staff, I can guide you by warding into the ravens that watch over that land. Maester Karen's eyes glimmered with scholarly excitement. Yes. Perfect. If the staff is indeed there, we'll retrieve it, bring it together with the crown and the dagger, and complete the thrice-forged circle. Daenerys placed a steadying hand on the table. We have no time for hesitation then. We must form a small, swift expedition to the Hill of Faces, retrieve the staff, and return. Meanwhile, the main forces can remain at Winterfell, prepared to defend against any assault from the north. Jon nodded, though Daenerys could see the tension in his jaw. Agreed. But this journey could be dangerous. The neck is treacherous even in the best seasons. Now, with winter upon us and the threat of roving whites, we'll need a capable group. Sansa interjected gently. I'll remain here to command. We can't leave Winterfell leaderless, and I suspect stealth might be more important than an entire army in the swamps. But do be careful. We can't lose you both if something goes wrong. Her eyes rested on Daenerys, who nodded in gratitude for the concern. She was keenly aware of the precarious nature of this quest. But if it meant an end to the undead threat, it was worth the gamble. Preparations began at once. They selected a handful of skilled fighters who could handle themselves in rough terrain, gray-eyed rangers, a few of the free folk who knew the lay of northern swamps, and Arya Stark, who insisted on joining them. Bran would remain at Winterfell, guiding them through warging sessions with ravens, offering directions as best he could. The Black Crown and the Dagger would travel with Daenerys and Jon in a sealed chest guarded by Unsullied. Maester Karen insisted on coming as well, determined to witness the staff's recovery firsthand. 2 days later, they set out from Winterfell under a gray sky. The journey to the Neck was a stark contrast to the open fields of the far north. As they rode south, the land shifted from snowy plains to marshy terrain, where winter's chill made the ground half frozen, half mud. The wind carried a tang of decay from stagnant pools. Low-hanging branches snagged at cloaks, and thick fog drifted among the reeds. Their pace slowed to a crawl, guided only by rough maps and Bran's instructions relayed via raven messages. Daenerys found the swamps oppressive. The cold, damp air clung to her, and the distant croaks of frogs sounded eerie in the gloom. At least the dragons soared overhead, though they struggled to find places to land amid the waterlogged terrain. She kept Drogon closest, Regal and Viserion occasionally scouting further ahead. Jon and Arya led the ground party, forging a path where the horses could tread. The Free Folk scouts, led by a wiry woman named Orla, moved quietly, eyes scanning for any sign of whites. Thus far, they encountered none, but the tension grew with every step. In such a remote region, if the undead attacked, they would have little chance of reinforcement. Maester Karen, perched on a sturdy pony, muttered about the gloom, though his excitement never waned. If the staff is truly here, it would be one of the rarest artifacts in all of Westeros. Imagine, carved by the children themselves. He fiddled with the chain around his neck, ignoring the grime that spattered his robes. They pressed on for several days, sleeping in damp camps under a shroud of mist. Daenerys took to riding Drogon when the ground grew too treacherous, while Jon scouted ahead on horseback. Communication was critical. Each evening, they lit signal fires to guide the dragons to safe perches. The sense of stepping deeper into an enchanted wilderness weighed on Daenerys. Now and then, ravens circled overhead, and she felt sure Bran was watching through their eyes, guiding them. Eventually, Orla and her Free Folk scouts found what looked like an ancient causeway hidden among twisted roots, leading to a low hill wreathed in gnarled weirwood branches. The Hill of Faces. The presence of so many weirwood trees in one place felt almost unnerving. Their white bark and carved faces loomed in the mist like silent sentinels. Daenerys dismounted from Drogon, letting the dragon prowl at the edge of the clearing. Jon approached on foot, sword in hand, though no threat was immediately visible. The Black Crown and Dagger were secured in a wooden chest carried by an Unsullied named Hazo, who looked around warily. Maester Karen stepped forward, his eyes shining despite the muddy ground. "This must be it," he breathed. "The Hill of Faces, where the children once convened." The staff might be hidden among the roots or in a cavern beneath. Arya moved silently ahead, scanning for traps. The carved faces on the weirwood trunks varied, some grimacing, some serene, some appearing to weep crimson sap. The hush in the air felt as thick as the fog. Daenerys followed cautiously, one hand resting on the swirling steel dagger at her belt. As they ascended the gentle slope, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a pressure against her ears, a hum in her bones that reminded her of the vow she had made. The weirwood branches overhead seemed to form a natural archway. Beyond it, a small clearing lay at the crest of the hill where the largest weirwood of all stood. Its trunk was enormous, its carved face faintly illuminated by the subdued light of midday. Jon inhaled sharply. Bran said we might find a hidden entrance here. Maester Karen approached, studying the trunk. "Look at the runes carved into the base of this tree. I see signs of the children's script." He ran his fingers over faint grooves. Perhaps yes, these are wards or illusions. They might hide the entrance unless we speak the correct phrase or something akin to that. Arya let out a small laugh. Let me guess. We have to say some magic words again. Daenerys caught Jon's eye. The vow? The forging words. Jon seemed to consider it. He stepped closer to the trunk, laying a hand on its bark. Then, quietly, he repeated some of the old words he and Daenerys had learned for the vow in the Godwood, bound in blood, forging flame and frost. At first, nothing happened. The stillness pressed in. Then Daenerys felt a faint tremor beneath her feet. The bark of the weirwood shimmered, edges warping like a reflection in rippling water. Slowly, a dark opening appeared in the trunk as though the wood parted to reveal a tunnel leading downward. A stale draft wafted out, carrying the scent of old earth and something faintly sweet. Arya swore under her breath. Maester Karen stared in awe. Jon exchanged a look with Daenerys. She nodded, forging ahead. Torchlight flared as unsullied soldiers moved to the opening, preparing to descend. Drogon rumbled in the background, but the opening was too narrow for a dragon. This would be a task for those on foot. One by one, they stepped into the tree's secret passage, leaving the cold mist above. The tunnel sloped gently downward, lined with pale roots that glowed faintly with an otherworldly luminescence. Daenerys' heart thumped. This reminded her of the hidden vault in Valyria where she'd found the map. Ancient secrets, older than the known world, lay here. After a short descent, the tunnel opened into a small cavern lit by more glowing fungi and lichen. In the center stood a stone pedestal carved with swirling symbols reminiscent of the children's script. Resting atop it was a slender staff of bone whitewood etched with fine lines that hummed with pale light. Daenerys realized it was indeed carved from weirwood, perhaps a branch of a heart tree. The staff felt alive even from across the cavern. She approached slowly, joined by Jon. Maester Karen hovered behind them, trembling with excitement. Arya and two Unsullied guarded the entrance. The air was thick with the same magical pressure Daenerys had felt at the crown's forging vow. Jon gave her a questioning glance. She met his eyes, then nodded. Together, they stepped forward. Each placed a hand on the staff. A jolt of power coursed up Daenerys' arm, a sensation reminiscent of the vow in Winterfell's Godwood. She sucked in a breath, hearing a faint whisper at the edge of her mind, like the echo of ancient voices. Jon's eyes widened. It's calling out. Daenerys nodded, feeling that same pull. She lifted the staff carefully, its runes pulsing with gentle light under her touch. It was as tall as she was, lightweight but impossibly sturdy. The swirling patterns along its surface reminded her of swirling steel, a twin to the dagger's design. Fire and ice, carved into weirwood. Karen stepped closer, scarcely able to contain himself. This is it. The staff of Heartwood, beyond doubt. We have the dagger, we have the crown, we have the staff. The thrice-forged circle is complete. The hum in the cavern built, then faded as though acknowledging their success. Slowly, they turned to leave, staff in hand. As they reached the passage, Daenerys felt a sudden prickle of alarm. She heard noises from above, shouts, distant roars. Whites? She broke into a run, staff clutched tightly. Arya and the Unsullied followed, weapons drawn. Emerging from the trunk of the weirwood, they found the clearing in chaos. The sky had darkened with thick clouds, and half-glimpsed shapes flitted among the twisted trees. Jon cursed under his breath. Whites poured into the hill of faces, dead eyes glowing. The Free Folk Scouts had formed a defensive line with the Unsullied, but they were outnumbered. Drogon roared overhead, blasting flame at a group of whites. The T scurried across the hillside. Rhaegal and Viserion joined him, but the canopy of weirwoods made it difficult for the dragons to unleash their full fury without risking the trees. The undead horde advanced with relentless determination, as if drawn by the staff's sudden awakening. Form up, Jon shouted, rallying the nearest fighters. We hold here. Daenerys handed the staff to Arya for a moment, freeing her hands to draw the swirling steel dagger. She sprinted forward, slashing at the first white that lunged. The dagger's pattern glowed faintly on contact, the undead creature collapsing into dust. Another white came at her from the side, skeletal jaws snapping. She sidestepped, plunging the blade into its chest. Another shriek, another pile of bone fragments. Jon carved through the ranks of whites with long claw, while Arya wielded the staff with uncanny agility, jabbing and sweeping. Each time the staff connected, whites recoiled as though struck by a force more potent than mere wood. The runes along the staff flared brighter each time, sending ripples of light across the clearing. Maester Karen cowered near the weirwood trunk, guarded by two unsullied. He clutched the black crown, which glimmered in the gloom. They're drawn to the relics. They must sense the threat. Then we end them here, Daenerys growled, slicing through another white. Blood pounded in her ears. The clearing filled with a cacophony of roaring dragons, clashing steel, and the dry rattles of undead limbs. Drogon descended in a swirling blast of flame, torching a swath of whites at the clearing's edge. Rhaegal's breath incinerated more. Yet the press continued, as if an unseen hand drove the undead onward. Amid the chaos, Daenerys glimpsed a figure taller and more regal than the whites, a white walker stepping through the trees. Its pale skin glistened, its icy weapon gleaming with malevolent power. Eyes burning blue, it scanned the clearing until it saw the staff in Arya's hands. With a silent snarl, it charged. "Arya, watch out!" Daenerys cried. She lunged forward, but three whites blocked her path. She cut them down with the dagger, whirling to see Arya meet the White Walker's onslaught. The staff clashed against the Walker's ice blade, sending sparks of magical energy across the clearing. Arya's face was set in grim determination, but the Walker was strong, pressing her back inch by inch. Jon vaulted over the twisted roots, rushing to help. He swung Longclaw in a downward arc, forcing the Walker to defend from two angles. Its icy sword shrieked against Valyrian steel. Meanwhile, Arya thrust the staff upward, aiming for the Walker's exposed side. The Walker twisted, nearly disarming her. Arya ducked under the ice blade, fluid and quick, though a slash caught her arm, drawing blood. Daenerys freed herself from the whites and dashed forward, dagger raised. The White Walker sensed her approach, turning in a swirl of hoarfrost. She drove the swirling steel blade toward its chest. It parried, glaring with its inhuman gaze. The staff in Arya's hands hummed, runes flaring bright as she jabbed at the Walker's back. The creature stumbled, struggling to defend against three foes at once. Jon found an opening. He slashed Longclaw in a precise strike at the Walker's neck. The blade bit deep, sending cracks of frost spreading across the Walker's body. It let out a piercing shriek that made Daenerys' ears ring. Arya rammed the staff into its abdomen and Daenerys plunged her dagger into its back. With a final cry, the Walker exploded into shards of ice that clattered onto the ground, dissolving into mist. The clearing fell eerily silent for a breath. Then a wave of disintegration swept across the remaining whites. As if they were puppets whose strings had been cut, they collapsed, their eyes going dark. One by one, they crumbled to inert remains. Daenerys stood panting, dagger clenched in her fist, uncertain of what had just happened. Arya staggered, clutching her bleeding arm. Jon rushed to support her. Maester Karen gaped from near the trunk. "Incredible," he whispered. "You destroyed the White Walker and all the whites under its control fell. I suppose that confirms their dependency on their masters. If the staff enhanced your strikes, it seems the relic's power is quite real." Daenerys frowned, her breath ragged. "I felt something a surge when we struck. The staff, the dagger, and Longclaw together. The forging vow, maybe it resonates through these weapons, especially now that we have the staff." Jon nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "But we can't rely on the same tactic to defeat the Night King. He's far stronger. Still, we have what we came for." They looked around the clearing. Their fighters stood battered but victorious among piles of dead whites. The Hill of Faces was scorched in places, the weirwoods groaning in the aftermath of dragon fire. But the staff was theirs and the undead forced to retreat or destroyed. Daenerys' heart thumped with renewed urgency. They had the crown, the dagger, and now the staff. The final confrontation loomed nearer. They gathered themselves, treating the wounded, ensuring no whites would rise again. By the time the snow-laden twilight descended, they were ready to depart the Hill of Faces. Daenerys felt a pang at leaving this ancient place scarred by battle, but there was no time to linger. Winterfell awaited, and beyond it, the Night King's inexorable approach. Thus, they began the journey back, slower than before, for many were injured. But hope flickered in Daenerys' chest. If the thrice-forged circle truly held the key to defeating the Night King, they might stand a chance of ending this long night before it consumed the realm. She clasped the staff tightly in her hands as they moved through the misty swamps, feeling its faint heartbeat of magic. The forging vow, hammered in blood and prophecy, whispered in her mind. Fire and ice bound together. An ancient promise renewed for the final battle against darkness. For all the hardships, for all the toll in lives, Daenerys Stormborn, breaker of chains, mother of dragons, now bound by a vow with Jon Snow, felt a quiet certainty that the dawn would come if they remained steadfast. This was her purpose, her destiny, and she would see it through until the last white fell, until the Night King himself lay in shattered ruin, and the living were free to forge a new era of peace on the ashes of the old. They began their slow march back from the Hill of Faces under a low, brooding sky. The swamp waters lay still around them, half frozen in the deepening winter, and the hush that settled over the company made every sound seem amplified. When her horse sloshed through mud or ice, Daenerys felt the vibration rattle up through her bones. The staff of Heartwood was strapped carefully to the saddle of an unsullied rider near her, while the chest containing the black crown and the swirling steel dagger remained guarded on another horse. Viserion and Regal flew overhead, searching for safer routes through the wetland maze, while Drogon circled near Daenerys like a vigilant protector. Jon rode at the vanguard, keeping pace beside Orla, the free folk scout who had proven invaluable in navigating the Neck. Arya scouted ahead when the land grew firmer, nimbly vanishing into the mist and reappearing to signal safe passages. Maester Karen stayed back in the central column, trembling with both exhaustion and excitement. Now and then, Daenerys heard him muttering about the relics, about the old texts, about how the last puzzle piece was finally in their possession. She doubted he gave any thought to how many had died for that piece of knowledge. The swamplands smelled of decay and stagnant water, thick with algae and rotted vegetation. The air itself clung to them, making the cold more penetrating than it felt in the open plains. Even the horses, hardy northern breeds, snorted nervously at each step. More than once, Daenerys had to pause and gently urge her steed forward, feeling how it quivered beneath her. On the second night of the return journey, they camped on a stretch of drier ground that rose like a small island in the swamps. The perimeter was ringed by dead trees, their branches contorted into skeletal shapes. The clearing gave just enough room for a few tents and for the dragons to perch without risk of sinking into mud. The men lit fires that sputtered in the damp air, casting flickering yellow glows on the trunk of each warped tree. Daenerys sat before one such fire, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness that came from hours in the saddle. She could still recall the shock of power when she first touched the staff, the sense of alien magic that thrummed through her blood. From the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Jon approaching. His cloak was smeared with mud and streaks of fatigue lined his face, but his eyes remained sharp. He settled down beside her on a makeshift log bench. For a time they said nothing, content to rest in each other's presence. The meager warmth from the flames felt precious. "How many miles left?" Daenerys asked at length. "Too many," Jon replied, poking the fire with a charred stick. Sparks shot upward. "But Orla thinks we'll clear the worst of the bogs by midday tomorrow. After that it's just the King's Road if it's passable in the snowfall. With luck, we'll reach Winterfell in 4 more days." Daenerys nodded. She glanced around the camp. Unsullied guards paced the perimeter in silent vigilance while a small knot of Dothraki huddled around another fire, clapping one another on the shoulders. Despite the trying conditions, her warriors from Essos had proven their worth in these uncertain lands. They were a bulwark against the dead, loyal until their final breaths. "It feels as though the noose tightens," Daenerys said quietly. "Every day, the Night King gathers more undead. We've seen only portions of his army. My dragons can scatter them, but not forever. Soon enough, all of them will converge." Jon's jaw tightened. "We'll be ready, or as ready as we can be. The staff might be what we need, but I won't pretend to understand how it will seal his magic." Bran mentioned a ritual, something to do with the vow and the presence of the staff, the dagger, and the crown. Daenerys stared into the flames. "If the text says it closes the door of darkness, we should take it seriously. My hope is that it severs the Night King's link to the dead. If we can do that, then maybe all his whites collapse like the ones did for that White Walker at the Hill of Faces. We wouldn't need to burn every corpse ourselves, just end his hold on them." A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks showering upward. Jon leaned forward and Daenerys watched the interplay of shadows across his face. A few feet away, Missandei and Maester Karen spoke in hushed tones, examining the staff of Heartwood under lamplight. Occasionally, Missandei ran her fingers across the carved runes as if trying to memorize them. Jon cleared his throat. "When we return, we'll speak with Bran again. Perhaps with the staff in our possession, his visions will clarify how exactly we must proceed." Daenerys nodded, though part of her bristled at relying on prophecy and half-seen visions. She much preferred direct action, guiding her dragons to victory. Yet she knew the White Walkers were no ordinary foe. Magic had birthed them, and magic might be needed to destroy them forever. The forging vow hammered into the crown, the swirling steel dagger, the staff now in their hands, these were all pieces of a puzzle centuries in the making. There was little choice but to place faith in them. She noticed Jon rubbing a bruise on his left shoulder. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "Just a little stiff from fighting that White Walker." A fleeting reminder of how strong they are. She studied him, remembering how he had leapt into the fray, how his sword glinted in the pale light, how Longclaw had connected with uncanny precision. There was something about Jon in battle that resonated with her own instincts, the swift willingness to risk everything for a chance at victory. The forging vow they had spoken still tugged at her mind whenever she stood close to him, as if something in her recognized a piece of herself in him. Restless, she rose to her feet, stretching her legs. "I'm going to check on Drogon." Jon nodded. "I'll do another patrol round the perimeter." They parted with a brief, shared look. Even in the midst of exhaustion, she felt the bond between them, not just from the vow, but from the adversity they had endured. Whatever the future held, they were in it together. She found Drogon perched beyond the ring of trees, tail coiled around an old stump. His massive wings folded tight to his sides as his red eyes swept the darkness. At her approach, he let out a low rumble that made her chest vibrate. She placed a hand on his scaled flank, feeling the tremendous heat that rolled off him. The wet ground steamed where he rested. "How long until we face the dead in the final fight?" she whispered, as though Drogon might answer. He snorted, a puff of heated air that ruffled her hair. In the distant sky, she saw Rhaegal's silhouette against the moonlit clouds, gliding in lazy circles. Somewhere below, Viserion roost on an old oak. Her dragons, her children, were all that stood between the living and certain doom, at least that was how it seemed on the darkest nights. She stayed there a while, stroking Drogon's scales, lost in her thoughts. Then, with a resolute sigh, she turned back toward the sputtering fires of the camp, her steps slow and careful on the slippery ground. In the days that followed, their march continued. The weather turned merciless. A storm blew in from the north, lashing the swamps with freezing rain that turned to sleet and then to snow. Progress slowed to a crawl, and the entire column huddled close for warmth whenever they made camp. The staff, the crown, the dagger, they became precious burdens that had to be kept safe from not just the undead but the crushing elements. Daenerys worried that too much moisture or cold might damage the staff of Heartwood, but Maester Caron assured her that weirwood was resistant to rot or decay. Still, each night, she insisted on storing it near the fires. At last, they broke free of the neck and found themselves on the King's Road once more, though the road was practically buried under drifting snow. Here, at least, the footing was more stable. They made better time, trudging through the whitened landscape until, on a bleak afternoon, Daenerys's scouts caught sight of the spires of Winterfell in the far distance. Relief hummed through the company. Daenerys felt it surge in her own veins. They were home, or as close to home as she had known in Westeros. Winterfell might not be her ancestral seat, she was a Targaryen after all, but she recognized the fortress as the only place that stood a real chance of repelling the Night King if it came to open battle. High walls, a loyal garrison, and the memory of countless ages watching over it. The gates swung open at their approach, revealing Sansa Stark and a handful of other northern figures waiting in the courtyard. Snow whirled around them, dusting the stones in endless layers. As Daenerys dismounted, she saw the worry etched in Sansa's features, though the Lady of Winterfell greeted them with visible relief. "You've returned safely," Sansa said. "We had ravens from Bran describing your journey, but it's good to see you in person." Jon dismounted beside Daenerys, his face set in grim lines. "We have the staff." "Where's Bran?" "In his solar," Sansa replied. "He's asked to speak with you immediately. He's been seeing things." Daenerys heard the unease in Sansa's voice, a flicker of fear about what those visions might reveal. She nodded. "Bring the staff and the crown. Keep them guarded at all times." The returning party filed into the castle. Unsullied took the staff of Heartwood and the chest containing the other relics, escorting them into a secure chamber. Daenerys, Jon, Sansa, and Arya made straight for Bran's solar, passing freezing corridors lit by flickering torches. Everywhere, tension crackled in the air. Even the castle's servants moved with hushed urgency as though expecting an enemy to burst through the gates at any moment. They found Bran seated by the fire, hands clasped in his lap. He stared into the flames, his expression as distant as ever, yet something about his posture suggested restlessness. When he turned his head to greet them, Daenerys felt that unsettling sense that he saw more than anyone else in the room. You found the staff, Brent said, his voice free of inflection. I felt it resonate when you retrieved it. Arya stepped closer to him, her arm still bandaged from the White Walker's slash. We nearly died for it. But we have it. Now tell us, how do we use it? Is it just a fancy stick, or can it really break the Night King's hold on the dead? Bran blinked slowly as though focusing on a scene far away. The staff is one of 3 relics forged in the Age of Heroes, one shaped from weirwood by the children, one hammered of Valyrian steel, and one crown that united 2 lines. Together, they conceal the darkness. But the act must happen under the open sky, in a place of great power. He shifted his gaze to Daenerys. You and Jon hold the vow. The forging vow. You must lead this ritual. Jon exchanged a look with Daenerys. Where? He asked. Bran's gaze grew more distant. Somewhere that resonates with both the old gods and the forging of Valyrian steel. The children once carved runes beneath the weirwood grove of the north on a high plateau near the Frostfangs. But it would be madness to go so far north now with the Night King roaming. Another place is the Isle of Faces in the south, though rumor says it is shrouded in illusions. Or else, we can attempt it here in Winterfell's Godwood if we can replicate the conditions. But the power might be weaker. He let out a slow breath. You would need a confluence of fire and ice. The staff must stand in the heart of a circle, the dagger drawn and the crown bridging the vow. If the Night King arrives, he would be drawn to it, perhaps forced to confront the forging's power directly. Sansa crossed her arms. We want the Night King to arrive? That seems a dangerous tactic. It may be the only way, Bran replied softly. The forging vow can sever his magic at its source. But only if the Night King is there in person. Arya let out a mirthless laugh. So we invite him to kill us in our own stronghold. Perfect. Jon's brow furrowed. We can't exactly invite him. But if the dead march on Winterfell as we believe they will, then we use that moment. We prepare the ritual in the Godwood. Daenerys and I will speak the vow, hold the relics, and try to draw him out. If the text is right, he won't be able to ignore it. The forging vow is anathema to him, a mirror of the magic that created him. Daenerys suppressed a shiver. A final confrontation in Winterfell's Godwood under swirling snow and starlight, with the staff, the dagger, and the crown. She could almost envision it, though the image came cloaked in dread. We'll have to fortify the castle more thoroughly than ever. If the dead storm the walls while we perform this ritual, we need time and space to complete it. Sansa set her jaw. Then we begin preparations now. The lords have been gathering here in greater numbers, bringing soldiers. The Vale is sending more knights. The Riverlands might offer what they can spare. There are even whispers that some houses in the Westerlands have grown tired of Sairs. Ei's denial and might send men. We'll need every sword. Bran's eyes slid shut. We don't have long. I sense the Night King gathering his forces as if he knows what is coming. He wants to extinguish the forging vow before it can be used against him. He opened his eyes again, voice subdued. We have only one chance. The meeting concluded in a grim hush. Daenerys felt the weight of fate pressing upon her. For days thereafter, Winterfell pulsed with activity, blacksmiths forging dragon glass arrowheads, stonemasons shoring up weakened walls, peasants pouring in from outlying areas to seek refuge. The courtyard filled with wagons of supplies, salted meat, and barrels of grain, for they knew a siege might be imminent. One afternoon, as Daenerys stood with Missandei near the forging pits, she spied something out of the ordinary on the horizon, a column of riders approaching, bearing a banner she didn't immediately recognize. Summoned guards rushed to the battlements, uncertain whether this might be a trick of the dead or living foes from the south. Daenerys had become used to enemies from unexpected directions. But as the riders drew nearer, their banners resolved into a sigil of a golden lion on a field of red, the Lannister crest. Daenerys's pulse kicked. Memories of her father's downfall, her brother's obsessions, and the betrayals by the Lannisters roiled in her mind. She had not expected any Lannister support. She exchanged an uneasy look with Missandei, then gestured for the gates to open cautiously. If they came with swords drawn, they would be met by the combined might of the north. A small party of knights entered Winterfell's courtyard, dismounting in the swirling snow. At their heads stood a lean man with blonde hair gone partially silver. He wore a thick fur cloak over gleaming armor, and when he lifted his visor, Daenerys recognized him at once, Jaime Lannister. Once the Kingslayer, once a man she had every reason to despise. Her guards tensed, hands on hilts. She stood in place, letting him approach. Jaime looked around as though taking in the fortress he had once heard stories about. His breath misted and his expression flickered through uncertainty, weariness, and resolve. He bowed stiffly but sincerely. Your Grace, he said, voice echoing in the hush. I come as a representative of certain Westeland's lords who have grown tired of Cersei's refusal to acknowledge the real threat. I also come on my own behalf to stand against the dead." She studied him, remembering all she knew of his past: regicide, incest, betrayal. Yet she also remembered hearing stories that he had saved King's Landing from wildfire, that he had begun to question Cersei's cruelty. Still, trust did not come easily. "What proof do we have that you're not a spy?" "Cersei's manipulations are well known." Jaime inclined his head. "I've broken with Cersei. She sits on the throne, but she sits on a throne of lies if she claims the dead do not matter. I've seen enough. I traveled north on my own, joined by those who believe we must unite or perish. We pledge our swords to you, Daenerys Stormborn, and to the king in the north, Jon Snow, if you will have us." Daenerys felt the eyes of her retinue, her unsullied, and the northern bystanders upon her. She could sense their shock, their distrust. But she also knew the dire situation demanded alliances, even improbable ones. A small part of her recalled Tyrion's counsel. He had once believed Jaime might act in good faith if pushed. And so she drew in a breath, willing herself to be more than just an heir to old grudges. "Your swords are welcome in the war for the living," she said, careful to keep her tone measured. "But know this: betray us, and you will find no mercy." Jaime nodded. "Understood, Your Grace." He straightened, the swirl of snow clinging to his cloak. "Where should we report for muster?" She directed him to speak with the quartermasters. As he led his knights away, Sansa approached, her face tight. "The Lannisters," she said quietly. "I never thought to see that banner within these walls." Daenerys exhaled. "Nor did I. But we need every sword, every shield. The dead care nothing for old rivalries. Let us see if Jaime is truly here to stand with us. If he is, then I will not turn him aside." Sansa nodded, though Daenerys sensed her lingering unease. The Lady of Winterfell had her own reasons to distrust a Lannister. Yet the war overshadowed personal grievances. Daenerys promised herself that if Jaime Lannister did anything suspicious, she would not hesitate to unleash Drogon's fire. In the following days, Jaime's small force integrated into the greater host gathering at Winterfell. A trickle of other southern knights arrived as well, some from the Crownlands, some from the Reach, all disclaiming any loyalty to Cersei's false peace. Word of the undead threat had spread, and those with sense had come north, hoping to stand on the right side of history or simply to survive. Through it all, the sense of inevitability built. Bran's visions grew more dire. The Night King marched with a massive host, tens of thousands strong, a force that dwarfed the army Daenerys had burned near Last Hearth. The time for skirmishes was over. They would soon face the final onslaught, the end of all things if they failed. Under Bran's guidance, preparations for the forging ritual in the Godswood intensified. Late one evening, Daenerys, Jon, and the Maester Karen met in the empty Godswood. Torchlight illuminated the snowbank that ringed the Heart Tree, its pale bark carved with a stern face. The air smelled of pine and the faint mineral tang of the hot springs that ran beneath the castle. Daenerys stood near the frozen pool, the staff of heartwood in her hands. Jon carried the swirling steel dagger at his belt. Karen held the black crown, half wrapped in cloth to protect it from the cold. They arranged themselves in a circle. Bran was not present tonight, but he had left instructions. Daenerys felt the press of the old gods, the sense that centuries of watchful eyes observed from the weirwood's carved visage. She raised the staff, letting the runes catch the torchlight. A mild glow shimmered along its surface, a reminder of the magic within. Karen cleared his throat. Bran said the vow must be spoken again at the right moment to charge these items with the final power needed to confront the Night King. But the Night King must be nearby, drawn by that power. Only then can the circle be completed, crown, staff, and dagger forming a conduit for the vow. Jon's gloved fingers curled around Longclaw's hilt. "And we hold off an army of the dead until that moment. We can't very well stand here chanting if whites are overrunning the castle." Daenerys met his gaze. "The main army will fight. We'll have to ensure the Godwood is defended until the last, or the vow can't be completed." She looked at the face carved into the weirwood, feeling its silent intensity. "You and I, bound by the vow already, will we recite it together again, as we did in the crypt?" Karen nodded. Yes, but with additional lines Bran discovered extending the vow from a personal forging to a final severance of the Night King's magic. The staff's presence is key, as is the dagger and the crown. The staff might ground the vow in the old gods, the dagger in Valyrian might, and the crown in the unity of your lines. A swirl of wind cut through the godwood, blowing snow into Daenerys's face. She closed her eyes against the sting. It felt as though the land itself trembled at the prospect of what lay ahead. Her heart pounded with the weight of it all, her vow to protect the living, her destiny as a Targaryen queen, and this bond with Jon Snow that had grown beyond mere necessity. She exhaled slowly. Then we do what must be done. We hold Winterfell, lure the Night King to the godwood, and complete the forging vow. One way or another, the war ends here. Jon walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. His eyes, dark as the winter night, held a quiet determination. We'll succeed, he said firmly, as if daring the fates to prove him wrong. We have to. The day of the battle dawned without warning. Scouts came rushing in at first light, reporting a horde of undead visible on the northern horizon. Dark shapes in the blowing snow, tens of thousands of wights, with white walkers riding dead horses among their ranks. The storm that accompanied them was savage, swirling black clouds overhead and whipping gusts of freezing wind across the plains. As the watchers on Winterfell's walls peered out, Daenerys heard the tremor in their voices. Even the bravest among them felt awe at the scale of this final confrontation. Alarm bells rang, echoing against the stone. Soldiers hurried into position, archers manned the battlements, ballistae loaded with dragonglass bolts. The Knights of the Vale formed up behind the walls. Cavalry prepared for a desperate charge if needed. The Unsullied stood resolute in neat formations in the courtyard. Their faces unreadable, their discipline unwavering. The Dothraki took station outside the gates, lances tipped with dragonglass and flaming torches ready to set their weapons ablaze. The northern lords marshaled levies behind the walls, forming a second line of defense. Even the Lannister contingent under Jaime's command joined the ranks, posted near the eastern rampart. The entire castle thrummed with tension. Daenerys stood on the main walkway that overlooked the field outside Winterfell. Drogon, regal, and Viserion perched on high vantage points, rumbling uneasily. She wore thick leathers and fur, her silver hair bound tightly in braids to keep the wind from whipping it across her face. Jon joined her, wearing his black armor and cloak, eyes scanning the horizon. From here, she could see the faint smudge of the undead host in the distance. "Soon," Jon murmured. "They'll be upon us soon." She nodded, heart pounding. The relics were secure. The Staff of Heartwood would remain in the Godswood, guarded by a select group of Unsullied and Wildling warriors. The Black Crown and the dagger were also there. At the appointed time, she and Jon would slip away from the battlements and make their stand among the weirwood roots, forging the vow. Until then, they had to do their part in the defense, commanding and inspiring. If the defenders collapsed too soon, the vow would never be completed. The wind shifted, carrying a biting chill that sank into Daenerys's bones. Overhead, the sky darkened, roiling with unnatural clouds. A faint blue luminescence crackled along the horizon, reminiscent of the eerie lights the White Walkers sometimes summoned. She felt Drogon shift behind her, his muscles tense. In the hush that followed, a single horn blast echoed from the watchers on the ramparts. The undead had arrived. A wave of wights emerged from the blowing snow, bodies in various states of decay. Some newly turned, others long rotted to the bone. They moved in an unrelenting tide, limbs flailing, jaws slack, eyes glowing with the necromantic light that bound them. Interspersed among them were monstrous shapes. Ice spiders the size of hounds, undead bears with frosted fur and glowing eyes. And behind them all, the Pale Riders. Daenerys counted at least 12 White Walkers, their ice-forged weapons gleaming, scanning the castle for signs of weakness. "They're not attacking yet," Jon muttered. "They're just assembling." Sure enough, the horde paused just out of range of arrows, forming a grotesque line that stretched as far as the eye could see. A howling wind cut through the battlefield, carrying with it swirling drifts of snow. Daenerys felt a prickle along her spine, suspecting the Night King was somewhere behind that line, orchestrating his legion. Her mind raced. She and Jon had devised a plan. The dragons would strike first, scorching as much of the horde as possible from above. That would force the White Walkers to respond, hopefully drawing out the Night King. Once he was in play, she and Jon would slip to the Godwood. But everything hinged on timing and luck, and on whether the Night King wielded a power that could down a dragon as he had once done in the past. Daenerys squared her shoulders. "We begin," she said softly. She signaled to the Dothraki outriders. Flames roared along their araks as they galloped forward, a wave of wild fury meant to harry the undead ranks. At the same time, she beckoned Drogon to swoop down from his perch, and she climbed onto his back. Jon nodded, silently wishing her luck, then hurried along the battlements to oversee the next phase. Drogon lifted into the storm-lashed sky with a beat of massive wings, Rhaegal and Viserion following suit. Below, the Dothraki thundered into the undead with savage cries, the flicker of their flaming weapons bright in the gloom. They collided with the first line of whites, cutting a swath through them. For a moment it seemed a glorious charge until the undead responded in kind, dragging riders from horses. Screams pierced the night, and the flickering flames of Dothraki araks winked out one by one, consumed by the living tide of corpses. Daenerys clenched her jaw, guiding Drogon into a dive. He roared, releasing a torrent of dragon fire that incinerated the whites below. She felt the heat wash over her, watching as the undead shriveled in the blaze. Rhaegal and Viserion unleashed their own streams of flame, creating pockets of smoldering ruin. Yet the horde was vast, and the White Walkers spurred more forward from behind. Waves of whites kept coming, as if drawn from an endless well. Retreat horns blared, recalling the surviving Dothraki to Winterfell's outer defenses. Arrows rained from the battlements, dragonglass-tipped shafts that dropped whites by the dozen. Ballista bolts soared, some striking undead giants or monstrous bears, though the swirling snowfall and the chaotic mass of enemies made precise aim difficult. Still, the defenders held for now, piling corpses at the foot of the walls. But those corpses sometimes twitched and rose again, raised once more by the White Walkers. Daenerys circled overhead, scanning for any sign of the Night King. None yet. She clenched the reins, urging Drogon to burn another swath of the undead. Below, her unsullied formed a disciplined shield wall, spears braced, preventing the whites from overrunning the gates. Brave northern warriors joined them, each holding dragonglass or steel. The field was a chaos of swirling white snow and black figures locked in mortal struggle. A crack of icy lightning split the sky near the rear of the undead host. Daenerys glimpsed a tall, horned shape astride an undead creature, possibly a zombified dragon. Her heart lurched. Viserion had once been turned, but he'd been freed and resurrected by the forging vow. Could the Night King have another undead dragon from some ancient lair? Or was it merely a monstrous steed he had conjured from the far north? She guided Drogon higher, determined to see. Sure enough, a pale figure sat upon a beast with tattered wings and bony ridges along its spine. Blue flame flickered in its maw. The Night King. She recognized that aura of cold malice, that aura of unstoppable power. He soared behind the lines, surveying the battle as though deciding where to strike. Daenerys's pulse thundered in her ears. The plan required drawing him closer. If he remained aloof, he could crush their forces from the rear with that undead beast. She had no choice but to provoke him. She spurred Drogon forward, Rhaegal and Viserion by her side, all three streaming through the storm-laden clouds to confront the Night King in the sky. Closer. She saw the Night King's expressionless face, his pale blue eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. He raised a hand, ice crackling around his armored forearm. Daenerys knew the risk. He might conjure another ice spear or strike them with that lethal magic. But if she could hold his attention, keep him from demolishing the ground forces, the defenders might hold. And if the forging vow could be completed, they might yet end his threat. Drogon unleashed a blast of flame. The Night King's steed twisted, the blue fire in its throat countering Drogon's inferno. The collision of flame and ice in midair produced a shockwave that buffeted Daenerys. She clung to her saddle, teeth rattling. A swirl of steam enveloped them. When the air cleared, the Night King loomed closer, his spear of ice forming in his free hand. He hurled it, an impossibly fast projectile. Drogon banked, nearly tossing Daenerys from the saddle. The spear grazed Drogon's flank, sending shards of ice and black blood spiraling. Drogon roared in pain. Daenerys felt her heart constrict. Below, Rhaegal and Viserion soared upward, flanking the undead dragon in a coordinated assault. The air filled with deafening roars, blasts of dragon fire, and the terrifying blue flames spewing from the Night King's mount. Lightning flickered in the storm. Dragons clashed in midair, jaws snapping. The undead beast tore at Rhaegal's wing while Viserion raked it from the other side. Drogon circled back, ignoring his wound, and lunged. The Night King brandished another ice spear, so close that Daenerys saw the unnatural frost swirling along its length. She urged Drogon to spin away at the last moment. The spear missed by a hair's breadth, plunging into the swirling snow below. A jarring sense of terror coursed through Daenerys. Even with 3 dragons, they struggled against the Night King's monstrous steed. She needed to drive him onto the field closer to the godwood. Perhaps they could force him to land if they battered him enough. Summoning her courage, she directed Drogon to surge in again. This time, Drogon sank his talons into the undead dragon's flank, ripping its decaying flesh. The creature shrieked in an unearthly wail, forcing the Night King to shift balance. Rhaegal and Valyria seized the opening, clamping jaws onto the undead beast's wings. All 4 dragons spiraled downward, locked in a savage dance of claws and flame. Daenerys clung tight, the wind tearing at her eyes, the ground rushing up. At the last moment, the Night King's steed wrenched free, half-crashing in a field of churned snow. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Valyria swooped overhead, their roars triumphant. The undead dragon flailed, scattering whites in all directions, the Night King still astride it. A swirl of frost erupted around them, buying him space to rise again. But the living armies advanced, spears brandished. From the castle walls, archers rained arrows. Unsullied thrust their dragonglass spears at any wight that came too close. As Daenerys soared overhead, she saw an opening. The Night King's mount faltered, pinned down by Rhaegal's vicious assault on one wing. The Night King swung his ice weapon at Rhaegal's neck, but Valyria clamped onto the creature's hind leg, dragging it further down. The undead beast let out a tortured shriek. Frost spread from the Night King's body, encasing the ground in shards of ice, but the living pressed on. Now, Daenerys breathed, urging Drogon to land. She had to trust that the plan would work. She slid from Drogon's saddle as soon as he touched the snow, ignoring the tremor in her legs. Jon, seeing her from the courtyard, signaled for her to hurry toward the godwood. She glimpsed Jaime Lannister leading a knot of knights, hacking at wights near the gate. The entire battlefield was chaos. She bolted through the courtyard, unsheathing a short sword in case any wights lunged at her. Grey Worm and 2 Unsullied peeled away from the defensive line to accompany her. Every step hammered with adrenaline. They raced through Winterfell's gate, crossing the yard where wounded knights stumbled, and then into the relative gloom of the castle's inner keep. Snow coated the flagstones. Arrows whistled overhead. Some wights had scaled the walls, but the defenders were pushing them back. At last, they reached the small archway that led to the godswood. The heart tree towered in the distance, draped in silent snow. Already, a circle of unsullied and wildling fighters stood guard, forming a perimeter. Bran was there too, in his wheeled chair, eyes half-lidded. Sansa had insisted on him taking shelter, but he was needed here, to guide the magic if it faltered. Jon emerged from another passage, panting, sword drawn. A few flecks of blood clung to his cheek. He nodded to Daenerys. "We're out of time. The Night King. He'll break free or turn the tide if we don't end this." She hurried forward, seeing the staff lodged upright in the snow beside the chest containing the dagger and crown. Arya was there, clutching her side, blood seeping through her leathers from the wound she'd sustained days earlier. Despite the pain in her expression, her stance remained fierce. Maester Karen hovered near the chest, trembling with cold and fear. Daenerys's breath puffed in front of her as she reached for the crown. "Let's do it," she said, her voice echoing in the hush of the godswood. She removed the black circlet from the chest, feeling the cool metal in her hands. Jon, the dagger. He drew the swirling steel blade, the same one that had killed White Walkers, that bore the strange pattern of forging. Meanwhile, Arya lifted the staff of heartwood and handed it to Daenerys with trembling fingers. Daenerys took it, heart racing. The carved runes glowed faintly, as though sensing the presence of the vowbearers. Bran's voice, distant but steady, drifted through the hush. "Begin." Daenerys and Jon locked eyes, stepping closer to the heart tree. The watchers around them formed a ring, weapons at the ready in case wights breached the perimeter. Bran's presence seemed to heighten the hush. Daenerys raised the staff, Jon held the dagger at his side, and the black crown hovered between them in her free hand. She felt an electric current run through her, reminiscent of the moment they'd retrieved the staff from the Hill of Faces. Jon's expression showed he felt it too. Softly, at first, they recited the vow in the old tongues, guided by the lines Bran had gleaned from ancient texts. Daenerys stumbled on some of the syllables, but Jon's voice steadied her. Together they chanted, words that wove references to the old gods, to the forging of Valyrian steel, to the union of dragon and wolf. The runes on the staff brightened with each phrase, and the swirling steel dagger glowed with an inner gleam. A sudden blast of icy wind howled through the godswood. Snow whipped into Daenerys's face, stinging her eyes. She kept chanting, gripping the staff in one hand and the crown in the other. Her heart thudded. She felt the forging vow resonate in her blood, recalling the moment in Valyria, the moment she and Jon renewed that vow in Winterfell. This was the culmination. A shriek tore the sky. She looked up, seeing the Night King's monstrous shape cresting the outer wall of Winterfell astride his wounded undead dragon. The beast's wings flapped raggedly, but it flew still, heading straight for the godwood. A swirl of whites poured in behind him as if the entire undead force now converged on the spot. She saw glimpses of the castle defenders resisting, but the wave was unstoppable. The White Walkers, too, advanced on the outer ring of the keep, their ice swords gleaming. "Hurry," Arya growled, limping to a defensive position. Grey Worm and the Unsullied braced their spears, forming a line to hold back the first wave of whites surging into the godwood. Sansa stood near Bran, her face pale but resolute, a dagger in her hand. Daenerys resumed chanting, a sense of raw power building in her chest. The staff in her hand vibrated. Jon's voice rose beside her. The swirling steel dagger shimmered as though flames danced within its metal. Snow swirled more fiercely than ever, and yet the godwood felt suffused with a strange warmth, like an invisible bonfire roared beneath the ground. The Night King dropped from his undead dragon, landing heavily on the snow-sheathed earth. His pale face and crown-like horns glinted with frost, and blue fire smoldered in his eyes. Whites clawed at the Unsullied line, dragging men down. Arya darted in to slice at one white, then pivoted to stab another. A savage melee erupted around the circle of defenders. Daenerys held her breath, continuing the vow. Each word sent pulses of magic through her limbs. She felt sweat bead on her brow despite the freezing cold. Jon raised the dagger high, culminating the chant. On the final words, Daenerys lifted the crown of black metal, aligning it with the staff. The circle was made, staff to crown, crown to dagger, dagger to staff. A ring of shimmering light formed around them, rising from the snow like ghostly flame. The vow poured from their lips, echoing across the godwood. The Night King snarled, an inhuman sound that made the air vibrate. He strode forward, ice weapon in hand. A White Walker flanked him, brandishing a spear. More whites crashed against the defenders as though trying to break the circle. Daenerys's heart pounded. If they were overrun now, it was over. But Grey Worm shouted an order, and the Unsullied line stiffened. Dragonglass spears pierced rotting flesh. Tormund Giant's Bane, from somewhere in the circle, hacked at whites with savage roars. Jaime Lannister, too, had appeared, shielding Sansa. Together they forced back the tide of undead, though the cost was high, men and women falling in the snow, blood staining the white drifts. The Night King pressed closer, stepping into the circle of shimmering light, his body tense, face twisted in silent fury. Jon's chanting reached a crescendo. The vow ended in a roar of archaic syllables. The staff flared bright as a torch, a column of light shooting from its tip into the sky. Daenerys felt the crown vibrate in her hands, searingly cold. The dagger's glow intensified, swirling patterns dancing like living embers on the steel. The circle of light narrowed around the Night King, forming a ring of crackling energy that barred him from retreat. He lifted his ice weapon, driving it down at Jon. Jon met the blow with long claw, the Valyrian steel scraping with a shrill note that shook Daenerys's teeth. Sparks of weird magic arced where the blades touched. The Night King's face remained impassive, but Daenerys sensed his urgency. He was caught in the forging vow's power. She kept hold of the staff and crown, focusing on the vow, letting it resonate in her mind and heart. She reached out, pressing the crown against the staff's carved runes. Heat pulsed under her palms. The black metal of the crown seemed to burn with icy flame, a paradox that made her gasp. The vow's magic rushed outward, enveloping Jon and the Night King. Jon gritted his teeth, pushing against the Night King's ice blade. The swirling steel dagger, still in Jon's belt, seemed to glow even brighter. Slowly, he let go of Longclaw with one hand, fumbling for the dagger. The Night King tried to slash, but the ring of magic hindered his movements. The forging vow was choking off his power, forcing him into mortal combat. Daenerys felt the tension roiling, as if the entire godwood might explode. With a swift motion, Jon drew the swirling steel dagger. The Night King hissed, striking at Jon's exposed ribs. Jon twisted aside, driving the dagger upward. The runic glow flared, forging vow thrumming. The dagger sank into the Night King's chest, right where his heart would be if he were human. A piercing shriek tore the air. The Night King spasmed, ice fracturing across his armor, cracks radiating from the dagger's entry point. Time seemed to slow. Daenerys saw him reach out as though to drag Jon into the freezing abyss with him. But the forging vow's magic crackled in a blinding flare of light. The staff in Daenerys's grip shot a lance of radiance into the Night King's body, the crown shrieking in her hands as if alive. The Night King's face twisted in a rictus of agony. His ice weapon shattered, shards tinkling on the snow. A thunderous boom rocked the godwood. The Night King disintegrated from within, his pale flesh dissolving into swirling blue mist. The swirling steel dagger glowed white-hot in Jon's hand, then dimmed as the last of the Night King's essence splintered into oblivion. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, across the battlefield, whites collapsed. It began at the edges, bodies going limp, half-rotten frames slumping to the ground. A chain reaction rippled through the entire undead horde. Within seconds, tens of thousands of whites fell motionless, eyes winking out like extinguished lamps. The White Walkers, too, exploded into shards of ice, disintegrating as if their puppet master's strings had been cut. The roars and shrieks that had filled Winterfell's courtyard died away. Silence reigned. Daenerys stood, trembling, the staff in one hand and the crown in the other. Her vision swam from the aftereffects of the vow's search. She forced herself to focus on Jon. He stood in the snow, chest heaving, dagger still raised. Around them, defenders watched in stunned awe. Bodies littered the ground, men and women who had fought valiantly. But the undead were gone. The final war had ended in that blinding flash. Jon turned slowly to Daenerys, eyes wide. She managed a shaky smile, stepping forward. They both sank to their knees in the bloodied snow, clinging to each other. She could feel his heartbeat racing, echoing her own. For a long moment, they simply breathed, the forging vow's echo still humming in their bones, the staff glowing with faint embers of power. All around, the living broke into ragged cheers, gasping in relief or weeping in disbelief. Grey Worm knelt by his fallen brothers, tears in his eyes. Arya slumped to the ground, pressing a hand to her wounded side, letting out a choked laugh. Sansa clutched Bran's chair, tears streaming down her cheeks, as if she could scarcely believe it was over. Jaime Lannister and Tormund Giantbane, covered in blood, shared a stunned look of triumph. No undead rose to strike again. Their ranks lay inert, robbed of the Night King's animating magic. For the first time in a generation, true silence blanketed Winterfell's courtyard. Snow drifted gently, unconcerned by the carnage, while the last flickers of unnatural storm clouds dissipated overhead, revealing a sky of pale dawn light. Daenerys slowly let the staff fall beside her. Its glow receded, leaving behind the carved runes, inert and peaceful. The black crown in her hand felt light now, no longer pulsing with power. She looked at Jon. "We did it," she whispered, voice shaking. He bowed his head. Together. For a moment, they simply stayed there, leaning into each other. The forging vow had reached its culmination, sealing away the Night King's magic. Daenerys felt tears burn in her eyes, not sadness, but overwhelming relief and a kind of awe at what they had survived. The realm was saved. The dead would trouble them no more. Drogon's roar broke the hush, echoing triumph from above the castle walls. Viserion and Rhaegal joined in, the three dragons circling overhead in a final salute. Daenerys felt their presence like a comforting wave. They too sensed the shift in the world's magic, the release of tension that had threatened to tear the realm apart. She rose unsteadily, offering Jon a hand. He took it, and together they stood beneath the old weirwood's carved face. Bran watched them with that same distant calm. There was a trace of a smile on his lips, as though he'd seen this outcome all along. Sansa stepped forward, tears still on her face, and embraced Jon. Arya did likewise, clinging to her brother and wincing at her injury. The Watchers in the Godwood murmured thanks to the old gods, to the forging vow, to the dragons, or simply to fortune. Daenerys turned, scanning the battered courtyard. So many had fallen, Dothraki, unsullied, northerners, knights from across the realm. But those who survived would shape a new dawn. A dawn free of the looming shadow of the Night King. In the hours that followed, Winterfell's defenders moved through the fallen, sorting the living from the dead. Pyres were built for the bodies. Priests of the faith, as well as red priests who had journeyed north, offered prayers to see the souls to the afterlife. Daenerys and Jon joined in the grim task, acknowledging the sacrifice of each man and woman who died to protect the living. Grey Worm, stoic as ever, organized the Unsullied to search for any faint survivors. Sansa oversaw the wounded in the Great Hall, turning it into a makeshift infirmary. Arya, her own wound bandaged, refused to rest until every corner of the castle was cleared of possible stragglers. Drogon, Regal, and Viserion perched along the outer walls, letting out occasional bellows as if celebrating their victory or perhaps mourning the fallen among the living. The sky brightened with a tentative sun that cut through the lingering clouds, glinting off the snow in dazzling reflections. The storm had passed. The world felt strangely still, as though uncertain what to do without the ever-present threat of the undead. Daenerys found herself alone in the Godwood later that afternoon, standing before the Heart Tree. The staff of Heartwood rested against the base of the trunk, inert now. The black crown lay in a simple chest, no longer pulsing with magic. The swirling steel dagger, cleaned and sheathed, had proven it could slay the Night King when channeled through the forging vow. She remembered how it had glowed white-hot as Jon delivered the final blow. Footsteps crunched behind her. She turned to see Jon approaching, quiet and careful as though not to disturb the hush of the sacred place. He joined her, gazing at the staff. "Are we done with it?" he asked softly. She nodded. "I think so. Its purpose was to seal away the Night King's magic. Now that he's gone, we can decide how to keep it safe. Perhaps in the crypts. Or return it to the children of the forest if any remain. It seems wrong to simply discard it, but its power is spent." Jon traced a finger along the staff's etched runes. "We should remember what happened here, so the next age can learn from it. The forging vow nearly broke the realm once when it was lost to time. Maybe in centuries to come, people will forget again. But we can at least leave behind the knowledge that the realm stood together against death." Daenerys let out a soft sigh. "A new age. The dawn after a long night." She glanced at the weirwood's solemn face. "It's what I wanted, you know. When I first set out from Essos, I dreamed of breaking the wheel, ending cycles of tyranny. I never imagined it would be this. Fighting literal death." He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "We made it," he said gently. "We can grieve the dead, but we should also honor them by building a better future." She gave his hand a slight squeeze. The vow they had spoken still hummed faintly in her heart, not as raw power now, but as a sense of unity. She felt the closeness, the shared destiny that had led them through the darkest challenges. The bond between the dragon and the wolf remained, no longer overshadowed by prophecy but shaped by choice. They had triumphed, and now they had to move forward. That night, Winterfell's courtyard glowed with dozens of funeral pyres. The living stood in quiet circles, heads bowed as flames consumed the remains of the fallen. Smoke drifted into the icy night sky, carrying the final farewells of men and women who had given their lives to stave off eternal darkness. Daenerys stood with Jon at the largest pyre, where unsullied and Dothraki bodies lay side by side with northern warriors and knights of other houses. Grey Worm presided over the pyre, stoic tears lining his cheeks as he lit the torch and passed it to Daenerys. She stared into the flame for a moment before pressing it to the logs, releasing a burst of glowing embers. The fire caught quickly, crackling and roaring. She whispered a silent prayer in High Valyrian, something to honor the souls that had departed. She felt Jon's hand at her shoulder, steadying her. The acrid smoke stung her eyes, but she did not blink. All around them, pyres flared, turning Winterfell's courtyard into a somber inferno of remembrance. An immense hush fell over the assembled crowd. Even the dragons watched from a respectful distance, heads bowed as if they comprehended the weight of the moment. Ash and sparks drifted upward, mingling with the stars. In that glow, Daenerys saw the faces of the living Sansa, Arya, Jaime, Tormund, Missandei, Bran, and countless others, each bearing their own grief, yet each alive to witness a tomorrow that had not been guaranteed. When the fires finally died down to smoldering coals, the new dawn arrived. The realm would never be the same, Daenerys knew. The armies of the living had united in a way rarely seen in Westeros, forging bonds that might shape the continent's future. She wondered if she might still claim the Iron Throne, or if that even mattered now. The Seven Kingdoms had survived an apocalypse together. Perhaps a new order could be born, one less bound to ancient feuds. She and Jon spent the morning in the Great Hall, meeting with lords and captains, accepting thanks and pledges of loyalty. Even the Lannister knights, led by Jaime, knelt before Daenerys and Jon, pledging to keep the peace in the Westerlands and to help rebuild the realm. Letters were dispatched across the land announcing the Night King's defeat. Some would disbelieve it, she knew, or warp it to their own ends. But the greatest threat was gone. In the days that followed, Winterfell slowly returned to a quieter rhythm. The wounded were tended with every resource at hand, and mass burials or pyres were concluded. Scouts ventured out to confirm that no pockets of whites remained. The news came back the same each time: the undead had collapsed en masse, lifeless once more. One evening, Daenerys found herself on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. The crisp night air nipped at her cheeks, but she stood unmoving, remembering how only days ago that same courtyard was a battlefield. Now it was scattered with supplies and wagons, the first signs of normal life returning. Drogon perched on a turret nearby, half-dozing, his scales reflecting the moonlight. Footsteps approached from behind, and she turned to see Jon. He offered a quiet smile and joined her at the stone railing. She sensed the unspoken question in his eyes, the question of what came next. "The realm needs leadership," she said softly. "The war has left deep scars. Food stores are low, cities in the south remain uncertain. And I have to decide what path I'll take." Jon looked at her, the wind tousling his dark hair. "You came here to claim the Iron Throne, but we faced a different war. Now that war is done. What do you want?" She ran her fingers along the stone, pensive. "A part of me still feels the pull of destiny. I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen. My ancestors once forged the 7 kingdoms with fire. But I've seen enough fire and death. I don't want to rule through fear. If the Southern Lords accept me as queen peacefully, I'll try to reshape the throne into something better. But if more blood must be spilled, I'm not certain it's worth it." Jon's gaze rested on her, empathetic. "The people have seen your dragons burn the undead, not their villages. They've seen you fight for their survival. That must count for something." She let out a thin smile. "Perhaps. And what of you, King in the North? Do you plan to remain at Winterfell, or do you want to share in shaping the realm's future?" He hesitated, glancing at the courtyard below. Men and women from every corner of Westeros mingled there, laughing, sharing rations, forging friendships once unimaginable. "Winterfell is my home," he said quietly. "But home can be more than a place. If there's a chance for peace, if there's a chance to mend the fractures of this kingdom, I'll do what must be done. I'll stand by you. Fire and ice, remember." She met his eyes, recalling how that vow had begun as prophecy and ended in choice. "Yes," she said, heartwarm. "Together." He stepped closer, their breath mingling in the chill air. She felt the weight of everything they had experienced, the battles, the blood, the vow, the quiet moments of trust. In that space, she realized that for once she wasn't fighting for mere survival or for a throne forged in old grudges. She was fighting for a realm that could be better. And she had found a partner who understood that drive, who had shared in the forging vow that saved them all. They stood that way for a time, side by side, until the wind shifted and carried distant laughter from below, men relieved to be alive, the realm rid of the White Walker terror. Daenerys allowed herself a small, genuine smile. The wheel had not just been broken, it had been shattered. The age of heroes had returned for one final war, and the living had prevailed. Now came the challenge of rebuilding, forging alliances not from fear but from shared hope. She breathed the cold air, letting it fill her lungs with the promise of a new dawn. Her dragons soared overhead, no longer the harbingers of destruction but symbols of a bond that had defeated the night itself. She thought of the black crown, the staff, the dagger, quiet relics now, each a testament to what could be accomplished when ancient oaths were honored. She thought of Bran, watching from some vantage of time, and smiled. The future was uncharted, but it was theirs to shape. At length, Jon took her hand. "Come," he said. "There's talk of a feast tonight. Nothing grand, just the men drinking and feasting in relief. You should join them. Let them see their queen among them, celebrating victory." She let him lead her away from the balcony. The castle corridors glowed with torchlight, warming against the winter's chill. Somewhere, a minstrel played a halting tune and the low hum of voices drifted through the halls. Daenerys felt the tension in her muscles easing, replaced by a cautious, fragile happiness. They had vanquished death, now they could honor the living. They reached the great hall where benches had been set up, men and women passing around stew and ale. The atmosphere was far from lighthearted, too many had died for unreserved merriment, but there was a collective exhale of relief. Daenerys entered, flanked by Jon, and felt the hush that spread. People stood, bowing or saluting. She raised a hand for them to sit. "We've lost much," she said, voice carrying just enough to be heard. "But we've saved more. I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I do know we stand here because we stood together. Your bravery, your sacrifice. It made all the difference." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the crowd. "Tonight, at least, let's remember those who fell and cherish those who stand among us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall, followed by soft applause. She took a seat near the center, with Jon on one side, Grey Worm and Missandei on the other. Sansa and Arya sat across from them, both exhausted but quietly content. Tormund roared for ale, ignoring the bandages around his arm. Jaime Lannister lingered at a distant table, sipping from a cup and casting glances that might have been wistful. Men toasted with cups of ale, while servants hurried with platters of simple fare. Daenerys sipped a cup of wine, letting the tang warm her throat. She listened to the hum of voices, the occasional laughter, the gentle swirl of relief that pervaded the air. Hours passed, and outside, the moon rose over a land finally free of the undead's shadow. The fires crackled in the hearth, chasing away the chill of winter. She felt a calm settle within her. When the feast wound down, she left the hall with Jon, each step echoing in the quiet corridors. They passed a window slit where the silver moonlight spilled in, illuminating the drifting snow outside. She paused to look, taking in the sight of a realm no longer haunted by a never-ending night. Jon stood beside her, silent, watchful. At length, she said, "Our next battle is for hearts and minds, to unify a kingdom that has suffered so long. I wonder if that will be easier or harder than facing the dead." Jon gave a half-smile. "Politics can be as treacherous as any white, but at least it won't be a war of extinction. We'll manage." She nodded, leaning against the cold stone. "Yes, we will manage." Then she turned to him, eyes searching his. "Thank you, Jon Snow," she said softly, "for believing in me in the vow. We wouldn't be here without you." He shook his head slightly. "Nor without you. Let's just be grateful we both made it through. Fire and ice. Maybe that was always meant to be the key." They stood, comfortable in the hush, the knowledge of their bond unwavering. The forging vow that had once been only ancient words was now lived experience. The realm still needed them, but they had a chance at peace, at building something new upon the ashes. Daenerys's heart stirred with a cautious, uncertain hope. Dawn broke, clear and bright, the morning after the feasting. For the first time in weeks, the sun's rays cut through the winter clouds, bathing Winterfell in pale gold. Daenerys walked along the battlements, observing the living as they began the day. The castle bustled with an energy that was neither fear nor exhaustion. It was renewal. Outside, the dragons soared in lazy arcs, no longer hunting the undead but simply savoring the crisp air. Below, men loaded wagons with leftover weapons and salvage, planning to redistribute them to outlying regions or store them for a future that would hopefully not require them again. Grey Worm led a patrol of Unsullied, checking for any final pockets of danger, though the land seemed at peace. Jon found her there, a roll of parchment in his hand. "A raven came from King's Landing," he said. "Cersei is dead." Daenerys blinked. "Dead? How?" He opened the parchment. "It's unclear. Rumor says she took her own life when news of the Night King's defeat reached her, or perhaps the small folk revolted. We don't know. But the letters from a council of nobles in the capital who claim they want to negotiate terms of unification under a new monarchy if we'll meet them. The war in the south might have ended without a single sword drawn." She stared out over the snow-covered plains. "So the last barrier to the Iron Throne is gone." Jon folded the parchment. "It seems so." She took a measured breath. "If we go south, we do it not as conquerors, but as liberators. We present a realm that has stood together. I won't burn another city." A faint tremor ran through her as she recalled the devastation she had once wreaked in Essos. "We have a chance to unify truly." Jon nodded. "Then let's do it carefully with counsel from our allies. Sansa, the other northern lords, the Vale, the Riverlands, we can make something better." She turned to him, a slow smile warming her face. "Yes. Let's." And so it began. After the final pyres were extinguished and the living said their last farewells, preparations were made to journey south. Not as a triumphant army, but as a delegation of peace. Daenerys would ride with Jon, the dragons overhead as a deterrent against any treachery. The Black Crown, the staff, and the dagger would remain secure in Winterfell's vaults, for their purpose had been fulfilled. The forging vow was no longer about harnessing unstoppable power, it was about reminding the realm that unity could achieve the impossible. On the day they departed, the sun shone brightly on Winterfell's walls. Snow still lay thick on the ground, but the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. Sansa and Arya would remain to govern the north, ensuring that the region recovered from the horrors of the undead siege. Grey Worm and a cadre of Unsullied formed Daenerys's honor guard, along with a contingent of northern knights and free folk scouts. Missandei, of course, traveled by Daenerys's side. Jaime Lannister and his men joined as well, though he maintained a respectful distance, keenly aware that trust came slowly. At the gates, Sansa and Arya bid Jon a measured farewell. Arya hugged him fiercely, ignoring the twinge in her bandaged wound. Sansa exchanged a nod with Daenerys that hinted at mutual respect if not outright warmth. Bran, distant in his chair, watched in that eerie, all-seeing way he had, offering no parting words. Daenerys suspected he already knew how their southern journey would unfold. With that, they rode out, the dragons sweeping overhead in arcs that sent swirling gusts of snow behind them. Daenerys felt a pang of nostalgia for the winter-choked land she was leaving, as though she had grown attached to the north in spite of its bitter cold. But another path lay ahead, forging a new era in the wake of the Night King's destruction. Days turned to weeks as they traveled south, passing the points where the undead had once roamed. Now the land showed signs of life returning. Villages that had braced for invasion opened their gates cautiously to trade. Farmers ventured out, checking what remained of their frozen fields. Everywhere, Daenerys and Jon were met with curiosity, fear, and sometimes open gratitude. News of the Night King's fall had raced ahead, and the presence of dragons confirmed the rumors. Few dared challenge them openly, and many seemed relieved that the rumored Dragon Queen came not to burn them but to assure them the danger was over. When at last they neared the Trident, the frozen rivers began to thaw. The air grew milder, the snows less frequent. Daenerys felt her spirits lift as the land softened into early spring. She recalled how she had once dreamed of traveling to King's Landing with an army at her back, claiming what she believed was her birthright. Now, that prospect loomed once again, yet everything felt different. This was not conquest, it was an attempt to mend a kingdom that had nearly died under the onslaught of ice. They made camp near the banks of the Blackwater Rush one evening, the lights of King's Landing visible in the far distance. Even from here, Daenerys caught the faint glow of the city's lanterns and the silhouette of the Red Keep against the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond those walls, a newly formed council of lords waited to receive them, uncertain and wary. She wondered how many within the city still remembered Aerys the Mad King, how many still whispered about dragons and fire. Jon sat beside her at the campfire, the crackle of burning wood underscoring their quiet conversation. "Hard to believe we're here," he said, staring across the water. "When I first traveled south from the Wall, everything was simpler. We had lords vying for power, but we never dreamed the dead would threaten us all. Feels like a lifetime ago." Daenerys poked at the fire with a stick. "We've all changed. The realm has changed." She turned her gaze toward the city lights. "If they accept me, I'll do my best to rule justly. But if they refuse and we risk more bloodshed, I don't know if I have the stomach for another war, not after what we faced." Jon reached over, taking her hand. "We'll speak the truth of what happened, of how we stood together and ended the long night. If that doesn't convince them, I'm not sure what will. But it won't come to violence. People have had enough of war." She nodded, relaxing into the warmth of his palm. Nearby, Drogon and Viserion perched in a field, the heat from their bodies preventing frost from forming on the grass. Rhaegal soared overhead, scanning for any sign of threats. The camp was quiet aside from the low murmur of watchmen and the rustle of tents. Daenerys found her thoughts drifting to the forging vow again. How that magic had once felt so overwhelming. Now it simply glowed in her memories, a reminder that together, she and Jon had defied the end of the world. In the morning, they set out for King's Landing at a steady pace. As they approached the city gates, Daenerys noticed a stark difference from her earlier fantasies of rolling in with a legion of Unsullied and Dothraki. Instead of cowering or raising defenses, the people of King's Landing lined the roads, curious to see the dragons that soared overhead. She sensed fear in their eyes, but also a flicker of hope. Whispers passed among them. The Dragon Queen who saved the realm from the dead. The king in the north who united the houses. They came not as conquerors but as saviors. At the main gate, a delegation of local lords and nobles waited, flanked by goldcloaks uncertain of their new loyalties. The city had roiled with chaos after Cersei's death, but a provisional council had formed, led by a few lesser Lannister cousins, several Crownland lords, and members of the faith. They bowed stiffly as Daenerys and Jon dismounted. Daenerys saw the flicker of apprehension on their faces, especially when Drogon roared overhead. She introduced herself, her words calm but firm. She explained that she claimed the throne as a Targaryen by blood, but also that she came offering peace, unity, and a vision of a realm rebuilt after the darkness. Jon added his voice, describing how the North had fought side by side with Daenerys' forces, how the forging vow had broken the Night King's grip on Westeros. The hush that followed told Daenerys that the magnitude of their deeds had not gone unnoticed. One of the council members, a gray-haired lord with watery eyes, stepped forward. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head to Daenerys. "The city is weary of war. Many starve, the treasury is nearly depleted, and the people are frightened. We ask, no, we beg, that you show them mercy and stability. Will you do that?" Daenerys gazed at him, recalling how she'd once wanted vengeance on the city that had spurned her family. But after all she had witnessed, that desire felt hollow. "I will," she said. "I have no interest in punishing the people for Cersei's sins. My goal is to see the realm prosper. That begins with feeding them, ensuring peace, and forging alliances that last beyond petty grudges." A wave of relief seemed to pass over the council. They invited Daenerys and Jon to meet in the Red Keep for formal negotiations. So began another chapter, the careful process of forging a new monarchy. Daenerys insisted on fair terms for each region, ensuring the lords who had joined in the war against the dead were recognized. She emphasized the unity that had saved them all, praising the North, the Vale, the Riverlands, and even the Westerlands knights who had sided with Jaime. At the suggestion of Jon, they agreed that the North would retain special status, acknowledging its hardships and unique traditions while remaining part of the Seven Kingdoms. Representatives from Dorne, who had mostly sat out the final conflict, sent word that they would respect a new Targaryen monarchy if it meant stability. The Iron Islands, under a new ruler who had ousted the last vestige of Euron's tyranny, likewise expressed tentative support, provided they could maintain some measure of autonomy. Daenerys saw how exhausted everyone looked, half-starved peasants, knights with haunted eyes from the war. Rebuilding would be a monumental task. The city's lower wards bore scars from riots and neglect under Cersei's reign. She vowed to direct resources to fix roads, feed the poor, and restore justice. If she was to be queen, she would not repeat the mistakes of the past. Yet she also felt the weight of the crown. The forging vow had been about saving the realm from an existential threat, but now she faced the reality of ruling fractious lords, balancing competing interests. She drew upon lessons from her time in Meereen, from the day she first freed the Unsullied, from all the advisors she'd known, Tyrion, Missandei, Yora, each offering a piece of guidance that shaped her approach. Jon stood by her side through every meeting, every debate, lending his voice and moral authority. His presence reassured Northerners who might otherwise have resented Southern rule, and his reputation as a man of honor soothed many who doubted Daenerys. The forging vow echoed between them, an unspoken testament that they had overcome a greater enemy than politics. Their unity had saved the living, now it served to unify the kingdom in peace. Weeks stretched into months. Repairs commenced across King's Landing, new aqueducts, new granaries, fresh markets. Daenerys welcomed farmers from the Reach to deliver grain, paying them with what little gold remained in the city coffers. Slowly, a flow of trade resumed. The sight of dragons circling overhead no longer filled people with terror but with a cautious acceptance. When Drogon roared, children peered from alleyways, pointing in awe rather than fear. She took that as a good sign. A gathering of high lords was arranged in the throne room, the same hall where the Iron Throne loomed ominous and cold. Daenerys walked in with Jon, the crowd parting to let them pass. She saw the gnarled seat of swords, the twisted metal that had once symbolized absolute power. She recalled how her ancestor Aegon had forged it. Now it felt like a relic from another age. She turned to face the lords, noticing Sansa among them, having traveled south, after all, to represent the North in final negotiations. Arya lingered in the background, her face impassive but curious. Bran had remained in Winterfell, content to watch through his ravens if needed. Jaime stood near the back, quietly supportive. Others included lords from the Vale, the Stormlands, the Reach, the Iron Islands. A mosaic of old allegiances, all gathered for what might be the final crowning. A hush fell. Daenerys stepped forward. She spoke of how the realm had nearly died in endless winter, how unity had saved them, how the forging vow had undone the Night King's threat. She vowed to rule not by fear or blood, but by justice, holding to the principle that every region's voice mattered in the governance of the Seven Kingdoms. She did not hide her Targaryen name, nor did she flaunt it with arrogance. She simply offered them a queen forged by hardship, tempered by the war against death. One by one, the lords bent the knee or offered respectful pledges of fealty. Some did it more grudgingly than others. Old resentments die hard, but the mood was one of cautious hope. They had survived an apocalypse together. Perhaps peace was possible. Jon stood beside her. When the final pledge was made, she turned to him. For a moment, she considered the Iron Throne behind her, the seat once seen as the ultimate prize. She stepped toward it, letting her fingers brush the cold steel. Then she turned away, facing the gathered lords with calm eyes. The throne symbolizes rule, she said. But rule is about people, not a chair. If you will have me, I sit among you, not above you. The lords exchanged glances. Sansa's lips twitched in what might have been approval. The throne sat behind Daenerys, a silent reminder of old ways. But the forging vow had birthed something new. In that moment, the realm shifted. They acknowledged Daenerys Stormborn as queen, not because she seized the throne by fire, but because she had led them through the long night and now pledged to lead them toward a better dawn. Cheers rose, hesitant at first, then gaining strength. Daenerys felt a surge of emotion welling in her chest. This was the dream she'd held all her life, but realized in a way she never could have predicted. As the people in the throne room bowed as knights clashed their swords in salute, she caught Jon's eye. She saw his pride, his unwavering support. In a quiet moment after the ceremony, Jon pulled her aside. "You've done it," he said, voice soft. "The realm is at peace and you hold the reins. No more war." She smiled, exhausted but exhilarated. "No more war," she echoed, hoping it would prove true. "I couldn't have done it without you. The forging vow is ours and it saved them all." He nodded, reaching for her hand. "So what now, your grace?" She laughed softly. "We rebuild. We feed the poor, we restore farmland, we listen to the people's grievances. We do the work of ruling. And for once, I think we can do it without an army of the dead at our gates." They stepped out onto a balcony overlooking the city. Smoke from countless chimneys rose into the sky, but it was the smoke of cooking fires, of life returning, not of destruction. In the harbor, ships began to dock, bringing supplies. The clang of hammers echoed through the streets as workers repaired shattered walls. Overhead, Drogon soared with Regal and Viserion, their shadows passing over the rooftops. Instead of cowering, the people gazed up with wonder. Daenerys closed her eyes, breathing in the tang of salt air and the scent of an awakening city. She felt Jon's presence beside her, remembered how they'd stood together in Winterfell's Godwood, forging a vow that transcended old hatreds. That vow had guided them here. The dawn was bright, the path ahead difficult but full of possibility. She opened her eyes. "We move forward," she said. "We build the world we want for all of them." And in her heart, she carried the memory of those who had sacrificed everything in the Great War, each of them a thread in the tapestry of this new age. Jon smiled. "Yes," he said. "We move forward together." And far above, in the crisp sky, the three dragons roared, their cries echoing over a land no longer cloaked in endless winter but dawning into a hopeful spring. The forging vow had done its work. The realms of men stood united at last, free to dream of tomorrow without fear of the night.